Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, and our members of city staff and our guests today. We have quorum, and I will call the 10th meeting of the Executive Committee to order. We acknowledge that the lands that we're meeting on are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. For those who are not here or those who are here and have to leave, you can continue to watch us on YouTube at Toronto City Council Live, or follow the meeting on your computer or tablet or smartphone at www.toronto.ca/council. Are there any declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act? And if so, please indicate the item number and the nature of the interest. Seeing none, we'll continue to move forward. May I have a motion, please, to confirm the minutes of the Executive Committee meeting held on October 23rd, 2019. Councillor Ainslie, all those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. We have 5 members present today. A couple of others are not able to be with us, so we'll have to make sure that we maintain the quorum here. And so I would propose we might have a break, very short break, sometime during the morning if people need to have one. But if they do for any reason, please let me know, and I'll try to accommodate that. I will also remind members of the fact that we have a statutory hearing scheduled at 10 o'clock today for the purposes of our visitors. It's required by law we deal with those matters in a certain way, and to hear those matters at a certain time that's provided for in public notices that are given. And so we'd given notice that matter would be dealt with at 10 o'clock this morning, and I don't know how long it's going to take, but we will consider item EX 10.6, which responds to a complaint filed pursuant to the Development Charges Act. Anyone present who wishes to speak, including the complainant, can address the committee on that item at that time. What I would propose to do with the concurrence of members of the committee is to, once we've done the rundown of the agenda, I think that will leave us time to hear what is to be a reasonably brief presentation from the Toronto Community Housing Corporation and our city staff with respect to the funding and the Tenants First implementation, and we should be able to get through that by 10 o'clock, the presentation, and then we will put over the matter of questions and so on until after. There's no deputations on that item, so we'll put over the matter of questions to staff and of the presenters until after the 10 o'clock item is dealt with. And are people, the committee members, agreeable to dealing with the agenda in that order? And that's so that we can deal with the Toronto Community Housing item and they can be on their way, because we have a modest list of deputations on the poverty reduction item, which will take longer. Everybody agreeable to dealing with the agenda in that manner? Okay. We also have a request to add new business from Deputy Mayor Councillor Bailão. The proposed item is entitled Update on the Review of a Potential Vacant Property Tax in Toronto. As that item, I think, has been distributed?
There is a small amendment. I think my office sent an updated letter.
Okay, so we'll redistribute an updated letter, and we'll deal with that at that time. We would have given people a chance to read it. Anyway, well, I guess we can't add the item to the agenda until we have it, so we'll wait till we have the new letter from you. So we have 6 items on the agenda with the 7th to come, and let's proceed with the rundown, which again won't take too long. Item EX 10.1 is being held, the Poverty Reduction Strategy 2019 to 2022 Action Plan is being held for deputations. Item EX 10.2, Implementing Tenants First, new funding model for Toronto Community Housing, is being held for a presentation and will be dealt with first after we finish with this. Item EX 10.3, Parkland Strategy. Moved by Councillor Nunziata. The staff recommendations, all those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Thank you. Item EX 10.4, Property Taxes 2020 Interim Levy Bylaw. This is really something that's standard fare. Do we have a mover for the recommendation? Thank you, Councillor Ainslie. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. Item EX 10.5, Implementing Accessibility Measures at the City of Toronto. This is coming from the Executive Director of Corporate Real Estate Management, and it is directing that the Executive Director report back on the implementation of the dynamic symbol, and there's some other matters dealt with in that report. Do I have a mover of the staff recommendations? Moved by Councillor Nunziata. All those in favour? Opposed? Carried. We have to deal with the item EX 10.6, Development Charge Complaint, 1251 Brattletown Circle at 10 o'clock. There are 2 speakers on that. So that, and then we'll have the other added starter when Councillor Deputy Mayor Bylaw brings that forward to us. So I think that does put us in good position to hear the presentation on the item EX 10.2, I think it is. Yes, 10.2, the implementation of tenants first. Ms. Phipps, welcome as always, and maybe you could go ahead and do that presentation, mindful that we will have to interrupt you if you're not done by 10 o'clock. I'm not trying to hurry you, but I'm just saying we have to interrupt the presentation and then pick it up again afterwards. Over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor. We understand. My name is Chris Phibbs. I'm the Director of Social Policy and Social Development, Finance and Administration. I'm here with Jen St. Louis. She is the Project Manager for the Tenants First project that you have heard about for the past 3 years. And we are excited to be here today with a report that details our thoughts on a new and permanent funding model for TCHC. You've heard from us before regarding seniors housing. You've heard from us about the scattered housing portfolio of TCHC. You've heard from us before on the interim funding formula for TCHC, and as well as board membership, tenant board membership. We've been here before you before. Today we are excited to be presenting what we think is a new funding model for the city's nonprofit housing company. So, in 2016, the Mayor's Task Force noted that the funding model that TCHC was receiving was unsustainable, and that the subsidy that TCHC receives doesn't bridge the gap between rising costs and flatlining rents. And so what this is trying to do is to anticipate the operating deficits that, TCHC is anticipating increasing operating deficits simply to meet the current standard of tenant services. Throughout all our consultations with tenants, what we have heard is that building maintenance and service needs to increase, needs to improve. And that has been the focus of every report and every initiative that has come out of the Tenants First office. This can show you that from 2014 to 2017, the actual operating subsidy that the city has flowed to TCHC. You can see that there are no capital funding dollars attached to this subsidy. It was basically a block subsidy that was provided to the housing company to operate. In 2017, Council told us, directed staff to create an interim funding model for 2018 and 2019. This report on the permanent funding model is to implement in 2020. So both of those funding models, the interim funding model and the permanent model, were intended to include both operating and capital. So you can see in the interim funding model in 2018, the city funded TCHC $241.4 million in operating and $160 million in capital. That was the first time that the city fully funded the capital needs of TCHC. Everybody has heard about the state of good repair. Everybody has heard about the backlog in TCHC buildings. This is the city's contribution and signaling its intent to improve service and building quality and standards for TCHC tenants. In 2019, the projected subsidy for TCHC is $238 million and only $40 million from city because of a one-time provincial SHAPE grant for $133 million. But the totals remain of similar magnitudes, around $410 million a year from the city to TCHC.
When we began this work, we looked at a criteria for the permanent funding model, which was presented in the Tenants First Phase 1 implementation plan in 2017. So this really guided our work to develop a funding model, and they were items like being predictable and stable. We wanted TCHC to know the magnitude of the subsidy they would receive and be able to plan appropriately. We wanted to allow for inflationary increases. We wanted the system to be simpler to administer for both TCHC and the city. We want to improve accountability and have the funding be sustainable and adequately provide for both operating and capital. So what we're proposing in this report is a rent supplement-based model. And what that means is that we are proposing that the city subsidizes TCHC up to amount that is equivalent to 75% of average market rent. So that amount, 75% of average market rent, creates a baseline revenue for TCHC. And the rent supplement part of that means that if, for a unit of a one-bedroom unit, 75% of average market rent is equivalent to $700. If a tenant pays $200, the city will pay the difference and top up to that 75% baseline. Included in this is $160 million annually, which will be applied towards the capital program. And each year after the baseline year, we're proposing that a cost factor be applied to the operating subsidy. And working with TCHC, we believe this amount is adequate to provide a good level of service for tenants and the ongoing delivery of the capital program.
So here we can see that the operating subsidy difference between 2019 and 2020 is about $12.7 million if we apply the proposed model. If you compare the per unit subsidy under this model to TCHC units versus other social housing provider units, we are still funding TCHC at a lower level than we are at other social housing providers. This model is about $725,000 a unit annually. To other social housing providers that the city provides service management to, it's about $11,100 per unit. So we're hoping that through economies of scale, that TCHC will be able to be the kind of landlord that we expect our social housing landlord to be. But it is still less than what we are funding other social housing providers across the city.
So the benefits of the proposed model, as Chris mentioned, we will still benefit from TCH's economies of scale. We are proposing a new and strengthened accountability framework. So realizing that with increased subsidy comes an increased responsibility to be accountable to council. It provides for flexibility to potentially move rent-geared income subsidy within the affordable housing system. So once we have the subsidy attached to a specific unit, then we can move the subsidy for one unit around in the system. And we also provided for council to monitor this model through the city budget process.
And that's the extent of our presentation, Mr. Mayor. And as we hope, this provides both a simple and predictable formula for funding TCHC and will also improve services to tenants across the entire portfolio, both the mixed portfolio and the seniors portfolio and the scattered portfolio. And we're happy to take any questions.
All right. Well, I think we have a few minutes before we have to revert to that item at 10 o'clock to start with the questions. And I see Councillor Carroll is here with us, and so you can be first.
Oh, thank you. Okay, you're going to have to sell me on the economy of scale amount. So you're hoping that to realize through economy of scale $4,000 per unit, so that they will be fairly served, 7,000 versus 11,000 per year per unit. That's a lot to realize through economy of scale. So give me an idea of how that happens. What are the tangibles that we would actually be able to run something more cheaply to that amount? And also, does the management model match the financial assumption of economy of scale if every few years or so we hear that people want more of the management to happen on the ground, more of the repairs to happen on the ground. So it sounds like trying to get economy of scale and centralizing a model, but then breaking through tenants' first policy down into smaller groups and decentralizing the management. Those seem at odds. So those are my two questions all loaded up into one.
So, go.
Through the mayor, let me start, and maybe staff and TCHC could augment. We've worked very closely with TCHC to understand their operating expenses, their capital needs in developing this model. We've also worked with them. I know that TCHC has plans to improve services right at the property level. And what this report also talks about and what we're going to be implementing is this is our starting point. Based on the experience that we had in increasing the operating funding in the interim model for the first 2 years, it seemed manageable. This brings it up and stabilizes that funding. It's very predictable. As they roll out their enhancements to service, we're going to be monitoring that and making sure that that model still works. So we're basing it on experience and what we feel their needs are, but we will be reviewing this model on a regular basis to ensure adequacy, and I'm not sure if TCHC wants to enhance.
Yeah, just it's through the mayor. I would echo what the deputy city manager has indicated. I would tell you that as we in our restructuring that we announced in the organization, where we're driving service levels and the management of service levels down further into the field and investing in frontline staff, that should substantially improve the service levels that we are providing to tenants. Councillor, we will learn more as we go through that process, and we will bring forward any further recommendations as they happen, as Juliana mentioned, as we learn more and deal with it at a time.
If I can ask a follow-up then. Okay, I'll go on this learning journey, but for the report and to come up with this model, we looked at that comparison. What are other service providers and co-ops, et cetera, really realizing for operating on a per unit basis? If we have frequent reviews to see if this works and see if in fact you can realize that kind of economy of scale or you need to bump it up, in subsequent reviews, can we continue to use that comparator? Are we delivering a service that is comparable to other service providers that we're working with? Will we continue to use that measure?
So through the chair, I'm quite happy to share that information with the city as we progress, Councillor, and I'm sure that the city would be happy to share that with this committee.
Do you share that you will or you won't? I don't understand.
Sorry. We will share.
Will you continue in the reviews to use that measure, that you're measuring the service we're providing in our own TCHC units against the service being delivered and the cost being used in other units as we go forward?
Yes, we will continue to, with our colleagues in SSHA, we will continue to watch that balance.
Okay, great, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Carroll. We had Councillor Pasternak with some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for this presentation. Uninhabitable units and the capital plan before us, will we be able to get those back on the market? My numbers show over 600 uninhabitable, and of course, when you have an uninhabitable unit, any kind of problems with it leaking or mold or those kinds of problems spread to other units. Are you tackling that?
Through the mayor, Councillor, yes, in fact, we are. We've got capital plans in place to bring a number of those units back on stream next year, and we'll continue in the following years to bring all those units back on stream.
Now, another problem was the high vacancy rate of, I guess, bachelor units, and whether we're on top of that issue as well.
Through the chair, yes, and yes, we are on top of that issue as well. Our rentable vacant units is now around 1,000 units, which is a substantial decrease of what it was when we started an action program to address that. We are now focusing even further efforts on the vacancy units in the bachelor space, and expect to see over November and December a considerable reduction in that area as well.
Third question regards rent security. And is there anything in this package that could cause an above guideline uptick in rents that our tenants pay?
No, there's not. The formula for calculating rent is provincial legislation, so tenant rents will not change. What changes here is the subsidy that the city provides.
So do we normally use the provincial guideline for rent increases across our system?
I'll pass that over to Doug to explain.
So the rent control guidelines don't apply to social housing because the rent is calculated based on a tenant's income, a household income, and not on the market rent for the unit. So we are required to follow legislation for all our social housing RGI units that provides us guidance on how to calculate the rent.
Does rent go up?
Rent fluctuates as people's income fluctuates.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Now, Councillors Fletcher and Perruzza are both here as well, and I sort of, before I went to, I should have asked if you want to ask questions on this. The tenants first. Pardon me? I'm listening. Oh, okay. Please, then, Councillor Perruzza, please go ahead.
Remind me, what kinds of things does the subsidy include? I guess what I'm trying to get at is maintenance. How much of the subsidy is maintenance?
So through the mayor, TCHC has its broad operating expenses. We know what it collects in rent, and what the subsidy does is bridge that gap between what they collect in rent, which is 30% of the tenant's income, and our subsidy then brings that total revenue for them up to 75% of average market rent, which in our estimation is a fair, stable, predictable amount for them to operate and start investing in maintaining their units.
Okay, so let me backtrack. Is maintenance part of that envelope, part of that money? Ongoing
That's correct.
maintenance. Pardon?
Ongoing maintenance is part of that. We've distinguished out of the subsidy that 160 million of that subsidy is going to be dedicated to capital repairs.
Right. So I guess what I wanted to understand is where does that break off? Where does maintenance break off and then it becomes capital?
So TCHC could augment, but there are regular maintenance requirements within buildings, and then there's state of good repair. And I think TCHC would better be able to differentiate how they.
Yeah, which leads me to my question. When you look at the overall subsidy, right? How do you calculate that maintenance? Like the maintenance that forms part of the subsidy, and then at what point does maintenance break off and become capital?
So through the mayor, if you'll recall, a few years ago, TCHC brought forward its state of good repair backlog and we came up with a 10-year plan on how to address that, and that involved securing capital funding from the other orders of government. So we had a magnitude based on their facility condition index on what we had to invest from a capital perspective, and that's how that 160 million got derived. It's the amount that they need to augment the federal funds that we've received to bring those buildings up into a state of good repair, and it's the amount to our best estimation that they're going to continue to need beyond the 10 years just to maintain those buildings in a state of good repair, so we don't get into a situation where 10 years from now we're in another backlog.
Yeah, no, maybe it's my fault. I don't think I'm asking the question the right way. I will follow up offline on that, but it's a number which I want to better understand, because when you talk about, sure, I'll stop there. That's now I'm getting into a speech. Sure, I will do that.
Thank you, Councillor Perruzza. Councillor Fletcher.
Just out of Councillor Perruzza, can you clarify the dollars for major capital compared to the dollars for minor or just maintenance capital that would mean staff compared to major, which would be somebody constructing something fairly significant?
So, excuse me, through the chair, Councillor, there was a bit of background noise here. Could you repeat your question?
Well, I'm just looking at the breaking out of the dollars between major capital, that's somebody else constructing all of that, and capital repairs, which is maintenance, essentially, small capital repairs. Do you have that breakdown, or is it just a large amount?
It's through the chair. We can certainly provide that breakdown as part of our budget process. And just for clarity, when we speak about capital repair, we are speaking to the items that are in the $160 million. There are two elements that we have with regard to our overall maintenance program outside of major capital repair. There is planned maintenance. So, for example, there is ongoing regular elevator maintenance and that sort of things that we plan in advance. And there's what we also call demand maintenance. And that is if a faucet in a tenant's unit breaks, as an example, that we will, on an emergency basis, go out and repair that. And we plan for both of those items. And we look at our history and we look at our cost structures associated with that when we are planning our budgets.
So just to be clear, planned maintenance and demand?
Demand maintenance, the
planned
best
and
example
demand.
I could use, if your kitchen
Yep,
faucet
got it.
breaks and you need to replace,
I
that's demand
understand.
maintenance.
Thank you, got it. And demand maintenance is urgent critical repairs in a unit that TCHC staff would be providing, essentially. Would it be contractors? Would it be TCHC?
It could be
staff?
contractors. Like if it's a significant plumbing job and we don't have the plumbing expertise on it, we'd need to contract that out. And we have contractors on standby to do that sort of work.
And then a call to the, I guess I'm just interested in the process to have that demand maintenance undertaken and the length of time between a call, and is that factored in anywhere?
Yes, we do, and I'd have to reach out and kind of get into the stats, but essentially they would call the call center, indicate that they've got an issue, or they would speak with the superintendent and they would lodge a work order, and that work order would get completed.
Is this going to cover, this will not be covering any pest-related issues, this dollars?
In our overall budget, including the subsidy that we are planned from the city, we are actually increasing the amount of money that we are spending on pest control.
I'm asking if these dollars in any way will contribute to increased pest control.
These dollars, in terms of the subsidy dollars, in combination with the other rent dollars and the other sources of funding that we had, yes, would
Great.
all contribute to pest control.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher. What I would propose to do is now to deal with this statutory timed item, and then we'll come back because I have Deputy Mayor Bilo and myself, and unless there's anybody else who wants to ask questions from the committee. And so we'll come back to that, and finish up the question period on the tenant's first item at that time. But it is now after 10 o'clock, and so I think it is a proper time for us to consider the timed item. It is EX 10.6, Development Charge Complaint, 1251 Bridletown Circle. This is a statutory meeting held pursuant to the provisions of the Development Charges Act, and it provides for registered speakers to speak to the item. If anybody wishes to speak beyond the two that I will introduce, they should register with the clerk. But otherwise, we will proceed to hear first from Mr. Robert Howe from Goodman's LLP to speak on this matter. And Mr. Howe, you're most welcome here, and you have 5 minutes to make your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, members of committee. The question before you this morning is whether 92 units in my client's development meet the definition of apartment unit in the DC bylaw and therefore should have been charged DCs at the apartment rate. I want to make it clear at the outset that my client is not seeking a break or a reduction in its development charges, but simply that the development charge bylaw be correctly applied. The units in question have a very unique design. They're oriented to families with 3 bedrooms each, but they're not traditional townhouses, back-to-back townhouses, or other forms of multiple units, which is the DC rate that staff applied. All of the units in question are condominium units, and like apartments, they're actually constructed above an underground parking garage, which provides resident and visitor parking to the units. The underground area provides other amenities that are traditionally found in an apartment building, such as garbage staging areas, shared locker rooms, communal bike storage, and they also have communal recreational amenities like apartments would. Because the city doesn't provide individual garbage collection to the units because they're on private roadways, private garbage collection is also provided to the units, just as it would for an apartment building. I want to have a visual that will demonstrate how the units work. So here you see the underground parking garage. The units are above. To access the units, you go up an external stairway. The stairway leads to street level, and right here is the entrance, which accesses a private communal corridor, and that corridor leads to the individual entrances to the individual units. The definition of apartment from the DC is set out accurately in the staff report, and to meet that definition, a unit has to meet certain criteria. It has to be in a building with 3 or more units that are accessed through a common principal entrance from street level and by an interior enclosed corridor. So to break that down, there are 3 essential criteria. The unit has to be in a building with 3 or more units. Access to the units has to be through an interior enclosed corridor, and access to that corridor has to be through a common principal entrance from street level. The 92 units in question, as we can see from the cross-section here, all meet all of those criteria. There are 3 or more units in each building. Access to those units is through the interior enclosed corridor, and access to that corridor is through a common principal entrance from street level. The 92 units in question clearly meet the definition of apartment units and should have been charged development charges at the apartment unit rate. The staff report suggests that the subject units do not qualify as apartment units because each unit contains 2 entrances, one from the common corridor and a second one from the outside. And this second entrance, you can see an example here, is generally from the private roadways, or in this case, a pedestrian mews, and it is actually slightly above grade. And staff believe that because of this second access to the outside, the entrance from the corridors here is not the principal entrance. And that's important because the definition of apartment unit in the bylaw refers to the principal entrance being from a common corridor. So if it comes down to which entrance is the principal entrance, I think we need to consider what the definition of principal is. There's no definition in the bylaw, so we look to what the normal meaning of principal is. The normal meaning of principal is primary or most important. And the primary or most important entrance to these units has to be the one that's most frequently used. And that's simply a matter of common sense. So which access to these units is the one that's most frequently used? It's access to and from the common corridor, which is the access that most conveniently accesses the parking area. Given the location of these units, of this development, that is the entrance that would be most commonly used, and that, therefore, is the principal entrance. While the other external entrances to the outdoors may read as a front door from an aesthetic perspective or an urban design perspective, and they will be used from time to time, they are not the entrances that are most principally used by the residents. So in our submission, these units clearly meet the definition of apartment unit under the DC bylaw, and accordingly, we're requesting the committee to determine that the 92 units in question are apartment units for the purposes of the development charge, and direct that development charges be charged at the rate that applies to apartment units. Finally, if you believe that there's any ambiguity at all in terms of how the bylaw should be applied, that ambiguity should be resolved in favor of my client, who is making efforts to provide innovative housing solutions and is delivering exactly the type of housing that this city needs: higher density, more affordable, family-oriented housing units, commonly referred to as the missing middle. So those are my submissions. We think the bylaw is clear. They should be apartment units. And again, any ambiguity should be resolved in favor of my client. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Yes, so the way I think we have Mr. Are you Mr. Waltman? Okay, you're separately listed to speak, so I can call on you because the time is up for this first submission, but if you wanted to just carry on, that's also fine. I can sort of allow you the same 5 minutes you would have got either which way, and then we could have questions to both of you if there are some. It's up to you entirely.
I'm here principally to address any questions that the committee may have, and I'm pleased to yield my time back to you.
Okay, that's fine. So, on that note, and thank you for that, other questions of these speakers? Councillor Pasternak.
I might have missed it in the presentation, but are these units stacked? Are these stacked townhomes?
No, they're not.
They're not stacked, no.
So does the apartment rate apply only to stacked units?
The apartment rate applies to units that meet the definition of apartment and units that meet the definition of stacked townhouses. We're not suggesting that these units meet the definition of stacked townhouses. We're saying that they meet the definition of apartment unit in the bylaw because they are accessed principally by a common entrance that's accessible from the street level that provides an interior access to the individual units. And that is the definition of apartment in the development charge bylaw. So therefore, we are saying that these innovative units meet the definition of apartment.
Can I add on to that?
All right.
Mr. Waltman
My
has
next question's to staff. Oh, you want to add something?
I just want to add one point. This is not a transit-oriented site per se, being in a suburban context. And most of our owners or tenants, as the case may be, use a vehicle to go to and from work. The landing that Mr. Howe referred to, which provides access to the common corridor, is in fact 6, perhaps 7 units removed from
risers,
removed from the surface, from grade. It is inconceivable in my mind, on a purely practical level, that somebody coming up from the underground garage would bypass that landing, would bypass the common corridor in order to go to their, what Mr. Howe referred to as their front door. We know that people take the path of least resistance, and they will go through a shorter, more sheltered route in order to find access to their home. That's why we believe that this corridor is and this common access point is the most frequently used.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to staff.
I think we would do the staff questions after we're finished hearing from the speakers.
Oh, we're not doing, oh.
No, so we'll do it almost the way we normally would with deputation. So we'll do that. Did you have a question, Councillor Carroll?
Sorry, yeah, and I should have indicated that earlier.
No problem.
Am I right? Are this is the development that went in where Timothy Eaton Secondary School used to be?
That is correct.
That's right. And there was some concern because inside the circle there's a fair amount of density, but then there are singles outside. And
No, that's not correct. In fact, on the perimeter of the site, there are stacked townhouses.
I think that.
right, there are. Yes, that's where I'm going.
Oh, I'm sorry, outside.
I'm quite familiar with the area.
I'm sorry, I
My parents
thought you
having
meant
lived there for
within-
30 years.
I'm sorry.
So there's quite a bit of density in the area, but there's also single-family dwelling around the circle. And there was some concern when this was going into the school site of not adding density because you're right, this is not a transit corridor. Even in the old former Transit City, there wasn't a plan in Finch East. So during the application for development and when you were working with the community, what did you call them when you were consulting with the community and trying to get approval?
I have to, with respect, disagree with you. There was no.
There isn't anything to disagree with here.
No,
I'm asking a question. What's the answer to the question?
No, I'm saying that, well, the premise, I believe, was incorrect. There was no concerted opposition to this development at all. In point of fact, we had a larger density that was reduced voluntarily in order to arrive at the plan that was ultimately approved. We never, neither in an informal public meeting or in a formal public meeting, encountered any substantial opposition.
I think the question may be.
So what is the answer to the question? When meeting with the community to seek approval for this development, what did you call them in order to achieve consensus in the community?
We had a variety of units on the property. We had stacked townhouses, we had conventional townhouses, and we had this hybrid, which frankly, we didn't know what to call.
Thank you. I should probably say here, because I have mentioned my parents living there for 30 years. My father, my surviving parent, does not. So I won't be declaring a conflict in this item because he no longer lives anywhere near there.
Thank you.
Can I make one comment?
Of course. Yeah.
Even if the units had been marketed as townhouses as part of the marketing material when the units were sold, that's not the question that's before the committee. The question that's before the committee is whether or not these units meet the definition of apartment unit in the development charge bylaw. It's a legal question that's before you and that you're entitled to make a decision in respect of. So whether they were marketed as townhouse units or not really is not relevant to the question that's before you.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I do recall when the word marketing was used in this context, we did refer to the units in question as city towns. We refer to the stacked townhouses as Eurotowns, and the conventional townhouses we call townhouses. I hope that addresses your question most accurately.
Okay. Are there any other questions of the deputants? Okay, well, hearing none, I'll thank you both very much. We would now then move to questions of staff that I think there was at least one that Councillor Pasternak first said he had, and then we'll go to Councillor Nunziata and we can go from there. So Councillor Pasternak, you said you had a question of staff.
I just wanted, through you to staff, Mr. Mayor, I just wanted to focus on page 4 of the report, where you reference that the apartment unit must be stacked, and these are not. Do you stand by those comments?
Yes, that's correct. They're not. There's no contention that they're considered stacked units.
So all this talk about hallways and entrances and I don't know, common walls, side walls. What is all that?
Through the chair, our bylaw is based on the assumed number of people per unit. And believe it or not, we get StatsCan data that says one form of development has more people in it than another, and apartments are one of those categories, and multiples are another. And that drives our charges. Then we develop a definition for the bylaw to help the Toronto building staff distinguish between the two types when people come in to get their permit. The definition of an apartment was accurately given by the applicant here, and it comes down to having a common principal entrance from the street level and an interior enclosed corridor, and these are the descriptions we use to allow an interpretation of an apartment, and so they become somewhat relevant, I guess, to the issue. And staff believe that, and we met with the applicant on a number of occasions and did our best to understand their position, that the entrance that's purported to be principal and common and from a street level is an access essentially to a corridor that feeds the underground parking, and not the principal entrance, which in fact, in our view and in staff's view, is the front door to the units. And so all of these issues are in play. It's complicated. Staff endeavor to provide a consistent and fair interpretation of the bylaw, and we believe we've done so in this case.
So at the end of the day, the notwithstanding clause in what's before us is, are these units stacked or not, and they are not stacked?
The question, I believe, is, are these units apartments or are they multiples, which is the term for townhouses?
But if they're not stacked, they don't qualify.
If they qualify as an apartment, as the applicant suggests, then you might find in their favor. But we believe they are not apartments. We believe they are back-to-back townhouses.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Pasternak. Councillor Nunziata, did I see you?
Yeah, some of my questions Councillor Pasternak asked. But in the report, it says that the applicant paid the development charges under protest. So I assume that there were a number of meetings with the applicant and with city staff prior to this, and they paid the development charges so they can get their building permit. My question, that was one question. My question is, when the application was submitted into the city, what was the application?
So they did apply, they got their permit, they paid the fees as assessed by the city and disputed them. And at that time, from the very beginning, staff determined these were back-to-back townhouses, not apartments.
No, but their application, when they originally submitted in their application prior to getting a building permit, what was the application? What was the, that they were planning on building? What was the name?
Well, what they submit is a design, and we interpret that design as either an apartment or back-to-back
So
town.
it wasn't advertised in any way, it was just advertised as,
Our Toronto building staff, and they're here, I believe they simply look at the drawings.
oh, okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't look over to you, Councillor Carroll, first before I started with the committee members. Did you have a question of staff at all, or any? Okay. Anybody, did you, Councillor Perruzza? Please.
The question of staff is, based on the different interpretation, how much money are we talking about? And two, if you did make a change, would that then set a precedent for similar type development to be considered in a similar way? So how much money, and would it set a precedent if you were to make a decision, if you were to accept their definition of what, how this is used?
Certainly, through the chair. The report identifies a little over $700,000 as the disputed amount, or the implication of the different assessment. You know, our staff simply interpret a bylaw that is approved every 5 years, and we do our best to apply that consistently and fairly, and the applicant has the right to seek a hearing when there are questions of how we've interpreted it. We think we've interpreted it correctly, and the precedent value of this, it's very difficult to say. It's a somewhat unique development, I think we all agree. But I would say to you that we consider ourselves the experts in doing this interpretation, and we ask you to support our recommendation.
You all right then, Councillor? Okay, thank you. Councillor Nunziata, did you already? Okay. Anybody else? Councillor Ainsley? I just wasn't quite satisfied. I heard what the applicant here said with respect to city towns and Euro towns and regular towns, but there was reference made to the building people that had a look at this, and there must have been some answer to the question that somebody, I think it was Councillor Nunziata, asked, which is, what did the application say? That's relevant to me, not in the context of, I know that the council indicated that it's only a question of interpreting the law, but I mean, I'm assuming maybe that the people who made the application interpreted the law themselves in calling something by a certain name when they made the application. I think it's just a relevant piece of information. Does anybody from the building staff know what these, how they were described? We've heard an honest answer of how they were described in the marketing material.
Mr. Mayor?
Yep.
Just to your left.
Oh, there we are. Sorry, I was
Hi.
the wrong way.
Dwayne Tapp, Manager of Plan and View Toronto Buildings. So the application form did indicate townhouses,
Okay.
not an apartment.
Okay. Thank you. Though that was my only question of the staff. So we'll just make clear that we're finished with questions of staff then. Fine. We can move on to any speakers that there are, starting with anybody from visiting with us. Councillor Carroll?
Yes, I think the report here is great because it really lays out, and we always, every time we discuss development charges, we learn something. I just learned something new again from Mr. Hatton about that calculation includes what other legislators view as the perceived number of people that will live in a dwelling as part of the calculation. This is a development, but way back in the day, it was Councillor Delgrand's ward when Timothy Eaton was declared surplus. But this is an area where people do have an angst about density, because there was also the surprise application in the area of Bridletown Mall, part of that trend in developing all of the paved area in malls. So there's a little stress about density. Townhouses is a great thing to put in here. That was the application, and it calmed everyone down, and that's wonderful. But I think the most important question asked, there's all the fine points of this report, but Councillor Perruzza asked, does our decision set a precedent here? And the answer, if we're honest with ourselves, is, well, of course it does. Because the most common use of our tower renewal policy about what do we do on towers in the park is to wrap townhouses around things. On large site development, we see development applications for condos all the time. Always there are townhouses wrapped around them. Why? They're much cheaper to build than the towers, so if you've got additional land left over, that's what you put on them. Because beyond vertical buildings, the fastest and most profitable, fastest selling thing in Toronto and increasingly in the GTA is townhouses. Many, many people have realized, I'm never going to own a single family dwelling, but I could own a damn good townhouse. And so we see them going in infill sites as part of large sites. We see them going in everywhere. And so if you want to set a precedent in the most popular, fastest being built and fastest being sold built form in residential, that seems to me the wrong place to go setting a precedent of losing out on $700,000. And so the review of the staff that is very detailed and really speaks to what these were applied to be in the first place, townhouses, and what they have resulted in being townhouses, albeit with a maisonette entrance that allows an access to a parking lot. There's all sorts of maisonette townhouses dating back to the 60s in this town. But that issue of precedent in this built form really closes the door on revenue that we sorely need to service these, because as we also know, when you go to lower forms of density on a per person basis, the infrastructure that we need to develop with those development charges on a per person basis becomes more expensive. So the revenue we are asking for, we will need to serve the people who live in these. Those are my comments. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Carroll. Councillor Perruzza.
Yeah, I just simply want to say this, that even the federal numbers, and I agree with Councillor Carroll that that people like to market townhouses, like to mark kind of like apartment structures with kind of like walk-ups and all this other stuff as townhouse. They don't market them as apartments because if you market them as townhouses, the market gives you a higher return. You pay more for a townhouse than you pay for an apartment. That's my view of it. But more importantly, where it all breaks down for me is, and I look at my own neighborhood, people buy condos largely to sublet them because it becomes very, very difficult to buy even apartments, for that matter, to actually live in them, with your mortgage and your maintenance fees and so on. And if you do that, you still sublet. However, those people, those additional people in those housing forms are not captured by the federal stats. They're not captured by essentially by our stats, because you all know, especially when you get out during election time and so on, that you discover people living in neighborhoods and in housing in far greater numbers than anybody suggested to you, than the statistics suggested to you, than the voters list suggested to you, but they're there. And I understand that, and I because given the value of housing now and what it costs for housing, people come up with very, very creative solutions. And one of the very creative solutions is to have more people living in places and spaces than we ever anticipated. So for us to get into this sort of subtle conversation about how we're going to make that calculation and whose definitions we're going to accept, and I get it, that has value for these folks, because if they win the argument on that, they say, well, okay, we save a few bucks, and in our case, it's 700,000. But all I'm saying is that if those charges are based on the numbers of people that are living in housing and in neighborhoods, I think all of those statistics woefully come under a median number that we probably should be thinking about revising. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Perruzza. Are there others wishing to speak from the committee? Councillor Nunziata, did you have your hand up? No. Okay.
But I will move the staff recommendation.
All right. If there are no speakers, then I would accept a motion moving the staff recommendation, and I'll call the question if people are ready for that. All those in favor of the staff recommendation? Opposed? Carried. Thank you for your submissions. We're now in a position, I think, to add, if it's the committee's wish, the added item of business put to our attention by Councillor Deputy Mayor Bailão with respect to the potential update on the potential vacant property tax in Toronto. So I'll accept a motion, which I have from Deputy Mayor Bailão, to add this to the agenda. All those in favor? Opposed? Carried. It's item 7, which we'll deal with at the appropriate time. Okay. Now, that allows us, you have to sort of remember where you were, to revert back to the tenant's first item, EX 10.2. And I think we were at the stage where we had received some of the questions of staff, and I know I had some, and I think the Deputy Mayor Bailão was next. So you're up. Now, well, we'll wait for Ms. Phipps. Is she coming back, or is she going to stay where she was? Doesn't matter. Is she still here? There, so you're over there. So you're going to stay there. You were over there before, but that's fine. You can stay there. And Mr. Marshman, is he? He's nearby. All right. Go ahead then, Deputy Mayor. You're up.
Thank you. So the 75% AMR, do you take in consideration just the operating or the combined operating and the 160 million?
Through the chair, it's combined.
It's combined.
Yes.
So $400 million represents about 75% AMR.
That's correct.
Okay. And you obviously didn't take in consideration the funding that they're getting from the federal government?
No, Councillor.
Okay. But I'm sure when you need the needs assessment, did you take that in consideration?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to go over the allocation of the surplus. So is the intent to, in future years, to have a collaborative approach to work with TCHC on how to spend those surplus, or automatically be constantly clogging that back?
Through the Mayor, the intent is to work with TCHC, understand how that surplus was generated, what the needs are for the future years, and have a discussion on how, both with TCHC and then to be reconfirmed by council, how best that surplus should be allocated.
Okay. So you would be supportive of me ensuring that an amendment is put in to ensure that the surplus remains with TCHC? Maybe to the CFO? Oh, she's not in.
Through the chair, yes, we could put, I think, as it states in the report itself, the surplus, we'd be agreeable to the surplus remaining, but it would be a factor in consideration in terms of how it gets applied as we build the budget on an annual basis.
Okay. Okay, those were my questions.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor Bailão. Any other members besides myself that want to ask questions? I think everybody else pretty much has. Okay. Now if I can just find where I wrote them down. There we are. I don't know who this would properly get directed to, but the first is perhaps to Ms. Phipps. The purpose of setting a threshold of 75%. I mean, what was intended by doing that? Setting a threshold up.
Mayor, We use 75% because in conversations with TCHC, that was an adequate level of funding for them to deliver an improved service level to their tenants.
Okay. Can you trace back for me, if you want to say, over a period of 15 years, and I realize in that you weren't responsible with this over that entire time, and somebody perhaps can do this for us, as to what different practices, if there were any that you can describe in any way that it's other than ad hoc, how was this number, to the extent there was one in any given year, decided upon? Were there years when there was no such subsidy? I'm just trying to get at how this fixes a past practice and what the past practice was. Somebody can describe it over, say, that period of, say, 15 years.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Mr. Mayor. So in 2003, when we took over paying the subsidy for TCHC, we basically rolled over the funding they were getting from the provincial government. So we set a block funding arrangement, which paid mortgages dollar for dollar, property taxes dollar for dollar, and devised a residual operating subsidy, which was indexed annually by the Consumer Price Index. Provided no direct capital funding. Over the course of time, because 50% of TCHC's revenue were derived from tenants, and those revenues are flat, the CPI increase on the residual didn't provide enough revenue to keep pace with expenses. So over time, TCHC was able to direct capital from their operating for capital repairs. They ceased to be able to do that. And then further along in time, they felt pressure on the operating expenses on an annual basis.
So was it in fact the case then that under that method you just described, because of the erosion caused by inflation, that they were getting, in effect, I mean, over those years, were they getting kind of a steady subsidy that was just worth less because of inflation, or were they in fact ending up getting less at some points in time?
No, every year the subsidy went up, but their purchasing power was reduced annually.
Okay, okay. I just want to deal for a moment with this business of the relative the relevant comparator. I think you indicated in questions previously that, yes, that was, I think what the implication was, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I want you to tell us, that was a comparator that would be continue to be used, but it's not the only consideration that's taken into place. It is one, but could you talk a little bit about that?
That's true, Mayor. That's just one comparator that we will use. There's also an ongoing conversations with TCHC, review of service levels, tenant satisfaction. There's many different markers that we will use in order to ensure that funding is appropriate, stable, predictable.
And did I hear you indicating, somebody did, in the course of all this, that there would be, what I wrote down was a continuous review, but that, I think it was said that it would be done annually, and it was in response to the same series of questions from, I think, Councillor Carroll about the comparators, but that this would be reviewed, and that, you know, the need, as it were, and what was being provided for by this new formula would be assessed based on how it was going.
Yes, Mayor. Every year through the city's budget process, through TCHC's budget process, we'll be able to review the adequacy of the funding.
All right. I want to ask city staff, and then I want to ask Mr. Marshman the same question, which is, in the end, if you had to describe this in kind of the elevator description of what we're doing here, you know, what is the effect of what the approval of this will do as compared to the arrangement that was in place up until this time? I mean, I guess the last couple of years have been a bit different because the council recognized some greater degree of responsibility on the operating side. But what is the difference between having this and having what we had in the years kind of up till, say, 2017?
Mayor, the difference between the previous scenario and going forward is that the city is fully embracing TCHC as our social housing provider and is funding the capital needs of our social housing provider hopefully adequately, and that we are taking responsibility for our portion of continuing that housing in a good state of repair. And that hasn't been happening until the interim funding formula was instituted.
Okay, and Mr. Marshman, same question to you. I mean, you haven't been the CEO the whole time, but if you have been around in different capacities. If you sort of were to look at this regime, if approved by the City Council ultimately, compared to what you and your predecessors have been experiencing, what's going to be the difference?
I think I would call out two significant things. One, it puts us on the same basis of funding, as the balance of social housing providers in the city. And I think it's important from a consistency perspective. I think from in addition to that we have a much higher level of predictability in terms of what the funding is, because it's defined and it's formula driven. And so we can estimate what it is going to be, as opposed to in the block funding scenario. We knew that there was a block there, but the block could go up or down potentially. And so it was just a much less stable environment, so we can plan more effectively.
Thank you. Those are my questions, and so now we could move to speakers. Who wish? We have Councillor Carroll first.
Yes, I ask those questions because I'm really still not convinced that we can achieve the economy of scale, such the difference between some of the places that people are living, managed by other agencies in partnership with us, faith-based or whatever, when they're spending almost $4,000 more a unit per year, they're obviously making a better offering, and they're able to be nimble. Someone moves into a unit in a hurry, because often the people we're placing in a hurry because the people at the top of the list are the people in crisis. And so part of those resources, part of the reason they're at a higher level of operating is to be able to do that thing that so many of us were asking questions about, what I call ops maintenance, the kind of maintenance that's done by operations staff quickly. Someone's moving in a hurry. The person who moved out just moved out 3 days ago, but you've got someone in an abuse situation and they need to move into this unit. Do you have the resources to send somebody in there to make the basic repairs before they move in? That's the most affordable time to do it and the best time to do it. And it also sets you up to have a better tenant. If we showed respect for the unit before we put you in it, you're going to have respect for it now that you are in it. And we miss that boat so many times because we just don't have the resources at the operating level to be able to do those kinds of things. So we sort of set a tenant up for failure. We set them up to be a less than perfect tenant, and the difficult relationship between them and the maintenance staff in that very complex they live starts off on a very wrong footing within 2 or 3 months of moving in. I've seen that scenario happen time and time again in the units in my own community. Resourcing ops maintenance to the point where we're modeling respect for this housing unit and how precious it is for the tenants week in and week out is how you get to the point where the larger capital becomes much more manageable and is happening in an appropriate time frame, as opposed to, we scratch our heads, why do we need so much state of good repair and capital maintenance? We seem to need more of it than private apartment operators. It's resourcing it on the front end, on the operating side. And I think it's why you hear councillors starting to ask, not about the large capital, but why aren't we doing the small capital with operating staff more quickly so that we don't get to the bad point? And so I worry, but this first step, if we really are just viewing it as staff have indicated as at the very get-go, we've got to stabilize. We know that we got improvement by doing what we did 17, 18, 19, so we got to commit to that. I'll go along for that ride. But I really am going to pay attention to the reviews, because if we don't get the real uplift we're looking for, such that people really start to feel like we respect our properties and they're partners in that, we're going to have to come back to this and look at more resources. And so, so that's what I'll look for in future reviews. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Carroll. Councillor Prusa, any comments? Okay. Then we go to members of the committee wishing to speak. Deputy Mayor Barlow, thank you.
I can start. I do have a motion that I'd like to clarify, and I did, in my questioning, ask our CFO if she would be supportive, just to clarify that we are working in a collaborative way. We just don't want TCHC to think that they need to make sure that the money is going out the door. We need to make sure that the money is being spent efficiently, effectively, and for the good of the tenants, and that we're in a collaborative relationship. I just want to start by saying how special I know that for a lot of people this moment is. I'm looking in the room, I see Effie there, and we started this fight maybe 7 years ago when we actually started looking at TCHC because there was a whole bunch of scattered houses, the majority of the scattered houses that were going to be put up for sale that would reduce the stock of affordable housing in our city to solve the problem, and it wouldn't even solve the problem. It was just to start to address the problem because it was going to bring something like $200 million at the time, and we had over $2 billion. And over the last 7 years, we've stopped the sale of the homes. We maintained that stock in affordable housing. There's an RFP now on the street to actually have a land trust or a co-op or an organization actually taking care of that. We're restructuring Toronto Community Housing. We've worked with the federal government to bring $1.3 billion into capital repairs, and that needs to be taken into account because when we say that the funding here is a 75% AMR and the other organizations have a little bit more, yes, but they don't have the $1.3 billion as well from the federal government. But let's remind ourselves, when we started this work, we had a budget of about $197 million, including capital. TCHC was spending $50 million in capital. What we're doing here today is we're doubling the funding for this organization. We're taking ownership over these units. We're saying we're maintaining the stock of affordable housing. We're having healthy, livable, safe conditions for our tenants to live, and we're going to create the conditions for the corporation to say we have predictable funding that we can work towards goals of customer satisfaction for our tenants, cleanliness for our tenants, activities to be a good landlord, to focus on being a good landlord. But let's see what we have in front of us. What we have in front of us, it's a capital plan that got funding from federal government when many said it would never come, that the city has now embarked to make sure that we are at the table. We've doubled the funding, and we're saying we're here for the tenants. And I would be dismissive if I did not thank our Deputy City Manager, Juliana Carbone, because she promised me she would not retire until she solved this issue. Yes, she did. And I know that there's...
Do we have that in writing?
Oh, I did, with her blood. And I know that there's been a lot of work being done by the team at Tenants First, but I know that Juliana was very, very passionate about this issue. We've been at this issue for many, many years. Today, many people in this room, and I know many staff, are looking at this, and finally we're making good on this corporation that, yes, it's been downloaded on us from the province, but for years and years the city was neglecting accepting it, and we were not funding it properly. We're not looking at it as our own responsibility. And today what we're doing in here is saying we're going to take responsibility. We know it is our asset, but most importantly, these are our residents, and we're going to be funding it properly. So I really want to thank staff. I want to thank all the tenants. I see many of them here, all the tenants, people that have been involved in advocating for this. It's not the end of it. We're just halfway through. We're going to continue to have revisiting. We're going to continue to analyze. We need to make sure that this money translates into exactly what we want, which is better housing for our tenants. That work needs to continue, but I think we need to acknowledge that this is a big step, big step that the city is taking to make sure that we live up to being a good landlord and to be a good corporate citizen.
I think Councillor Carroll was asking if she could ask a question of the mover, and apparently the procedural rules are silent on that, but I'm prepared to permit you to do so.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm just... It's a big leap to say you get to keep your surplus. That's a big leap in budget policy, but I'm prepared to do it because this is such an extreme and urgent situation. I'm just worried about the last line. Its use be directed by the city through the budget process. Are you sure you don't want to sweater that in some way? It must be used on capital or something like that. And the reason I ask that question is I'm anticipating our wacky special budget council session where someone could say, and, you know, people will start doing their backstroke through the books to see if you have a surplus to ask for this thing in my ward right now, which could then undermine both the board and your capital plan.
I think this is it's the discussion that our staff and TCHC are going to have. So we have a much closer relationship nowadays. Our staff, our finance staff works with TCHC on a line by line, and I think that conversation, that cooperation needs to happen, and it's right now happening through the budget process, and that's why I put it, because everybody agrees that
Right,
this
but
is where we have the visibility.
You're not worried about the vulnerability, because that, you're not opening it up to city staff, you're opening it up to city council. And every motion they might move
I don't
at
think
special
they're gonna-
budget council 1 a.m.
I don't think that we're going to have, I don't think that we're going to be, there's going to be a recommendation in general. I don't think we're going to be directly 5 million here, 1 million here, at 500 here. It's going to be
Yeah, that was my question, Councillor. It was a question.
Yeah, I think it actually was. It was preceded by a little bit of editorial commentary, but if we started to deem all those not questions, there'd be no questions asked around here at all. So anyways, fine, fair enough. Okay. Yes, of course.
Yeah, just speak for a minute. First of all, Juliana, we haven't completely resolved this, so you're not leaving.
Correct. All in favor? Carried.
On paper. So we haven't fully completed. I want to thank staff for the report. And I just want to say is that, you know, I'm pleased that we're putting, you know, millions of dollars into the capital. It's been a long time since this is, since we've had this come forward, so I'm pleased with that, and thank you to staff. I just want to say my priority, and I'm speaking on behalf of my ward, and I know the CEO, we've gone out on a number of tours of my building, is the maintenance of our buildings. Like, we really need to focus on the maintenance. Yes, capital, but maintenance of some of these buildings, like we need to focus on that, because I have a lot of buildings that, you know, are awful, and we need to invest in that. So I just wanted to make that comment. So I'm hoping that we can get some of the maintenance in some of these buildings where we're having issues with resolved, because to me that's a priority as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Nunziata. Other speakers? Okay, well, if not, I just want to say a word or two on this. And first of all, I want to say thank you to all the staff and to the people at Toronto Community Housing, of course, have been very involved in these discussions as well. But the staff have done a lot of work, and I'll leave it for others to judge whether the task has been completed. The thing about these things, to the Deputy City Manager, Juliana, they're never really completed. So that means you can never leave, which is fantastic. It's a great result, actually. I just want to say this. You know, I think that you can look at the numbers, and Deputy Mayor Barlow and others took us through those, and you can either say that just looking at the number of $400 million plus annually, which includes both capital and operating, and say that in and of itself is representative of a significant investment. You could look at the comparative numbers between what was the case just a few years ago, and we have $197 million, including both operating and capital, versus $400 million that is effectively produced by this new formula, which means effectively, again, a doubling. But I don't think that's really the most significant element, and Deputy Mayor Barlow spoke to this, and I guess I say it in response to those. There's been many trees sacrificed to write up the fact that the city has not taken up its responsibility seriously. And I would just say, take you back perhaps to the beginning of this administration. When I came to this office, we were sitting here in this very room having a lot of discussion about units that were closed, that were going to be closed, that were going to have to be demolished, because we were not prepared to put up the money to fix them. We were not getting any support from the other governments at that time. And that was just 4 years ago. There was really no money coming of any substance from the other governments, a tiny little bit from some mortgage refinancing from the feds, and I don't even think we'd seen the beginnings yet of any money coming from the province, which was given through green infrastructure programs and then disappeared as fast as it arose. And the city itself committed only to the extent on both operating and capital that it had to, based on an old funding formula that Deputy Mayor Barlow described quite well, and that the staff described quite well. And so here we are today on the verge, and I think that is why it is important to take note of this in the context of how important a decision this is, because the more important part isn't the dollars, they're important. The more important part is, as was said, the acceptance of responsibility for this, and that now we're going to have to factor this in, as I'm very pleased to see us do, into our own annual budget process each year. But I want to just make one point with respect to the question of uplift and so on that was made quite properly by Councillor Carroll, and that is what this does not say is that the other governments are absolved of their responsibility to be partners with us in this. And I'm pleased at the fact that during this administration, the federal government has stepped up and has accepted some degree of responsibility. That was a good start. We've not had such success as yet with the provincial government, but if we're going to get the uplift, it is never going to happen. Well, I won't say never, but it is going to take longer, and it's harder for it to happen if it's the sole responsibility of the city. And what I don't want this to be seen by those other governments as representing is us just saying, well, you're off the hook. We're going to forever and a day take sole responsibility for this, because that never should have been the case. It shouldn't be the case as of today. And I assure you, as long as I'm here, it won't be the case in the sense that we will give up on advocating and just say, well, fine, we'll look after it. It has to be looked after. That part of the responsibility we've all accepted, but it is a team effort. The province, who did download this, because we can't forget that part of history, even though we're at a historic jumping off point today where we say, okay, we accept the fact that reality is what it is in terms of who owns this and who has the responsibility to take a look at the funding of both operating and capital. That does not mean, it should not mean, it cannot mean, and it must not mean that we're letting them off the hook. That decision, done the way it was without any ongoing support for capital, was wrong then, and it's still wrong, and we have to rectify that. And if we can make some progress on the operating side too, then that has to be added to the list. The uplift that Councillor Carroll referred to is absolutely correct, and we have to focus on it. And I'm also, I like her, will be very focused on the annual sort of review that we've said will take place here to make sure that what's being put in place here is adequate. But I just think it's a huge step forward to have something put in place that guides us to a number that each year will be something that we know is our responsibility, and that we'll do everything we can to get others to help us with it. So I do want to again thank the staff for that, and I think I wanted to speak just to underline what a very important day this is, and I think it is not just an important day for the tenants of Toronto Community Housing, for the company itself, but also it is really very much a part of what we're about to discuss next, which is the poverty reduction plan, because these are some of our most vulnerable citizens in the city. So thank you for your attention, and I think, unless just anybody else has anything to say, we're ready to call the question on this. And we have, first, we have a, in front of us from, where did I put it now? Do you have it to put up on the screen? There we are. Motion from Deputy Mayor Bailau to amend recommendation 1. And if there's no further discussion on that, I'll call the question on the amendment that's up on the screen. All those in favor? Deputy Mayor, you want to vote for your amendment, your motion here, I think. All those in favor? Opposed? No, you're not opposed. You're just. Oh, okay. Okay. Carried. Thank you. And then the item as amended. All those in recorded vote. All those in favor?
On the item as amended, all in favor, Mayor Tory, Councillor Bailau, Councillor Ainsley, Councillor Pasternak, Councillor Nziata. That carries unanimously.
Thank you very much. And thank you again to the staff and to the TCHC people for their good works. Okay. That would then bring us back to item 10.1 on the agenda, which is the EX 10.1, which is the Toronto Poverty Reduction Strategy 2019 to 2022 Action Plan. We have, let's see, we have about 15 deputants. And what I'll do is I'll read out 3 at a time so people can kind of be ready to come and take their place when it's their turn. The first 3 are Dan Bingham from St. Stephen's, Susan Bender from Toronto Drop-In Network, and Nation Chong from United Way Greater Toronto. So those are the first 3. A reminder that you have 5 minutes. There may be some questions after your 5 minutes, but you do have 5 minutes. Dan Bingham. Thank you very much for being here, and you have 5 minutes. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Good morning, Mayor Tory and council members. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope my life story can help expedite and allow the council to move on this next option as quickly as possible. My name is Daniel Bingham. I am a part of a group called MAC. The Member Advocacy Committee is a group of people with lived experience of poverty, drug use, homelessness, and disability, and more. We advocate for a positive social change. Our group is committed to advocacy to reduce the gap between rich and poor and to assist strong social programs to benefit those who have the least in our society. We are grateful for this chance to help move forward on this proposal. Part of my story started 6 years ago when I almost died from severe depression and acute alcohol poisoning. I was living in an apartment that had bed bugs, cockroaches, and rats. I was a year and 1/2 behind in rent. I was tired from the struggle to go on. I drank for 3 weeks without eating. I went from 170 pounds to 122. I was almost gone. For the next 3 years, with the support of OW, 1 detox center, 2 sober houses, Oasis Services, Canterbury Clinic, St. Michael's Day Program, Alcoholics Anonymous, my family, my doctor, and my dear circle of friends, I worked on recovering. All of which I feel I would not have been able to participate in if not on the first of every month I had not been in the position to buy a Metro Pass. OW covered my housing and food, and after I got my pass, I had about enough to cover my coffee for the month. The pass gave me the ability to take training, to find work, which led to a 1-year contract at the Massey Center for Women. With this pass, I was able to take all the tests for a complete health checkup, as I had not been checked in over 15 years by a doctor. I was afraid of what the answer might be. This pass allowed me to volunteer at many places, including the Church of the Redeemer, where I cooked for 2 days a week for people in greater need than myself. The pass gave me the ability to create and sit on the board of directors for a nonprofit that provided assistance for women and children suffering from abuse. It was called the Phoenix Project. The pass made it possible to go to 6 recovery meetings a week and to give back by serving on the executive committee of AA for the Greater Toronto Area for over 3 years. I am now moving ahead by starting my own renovation business and serving on 2 condo board of directors for the Village by the Grange, vice president of one and chief signing officer of the other. In the past, I've trained successfully to be a peer support worker and worked at Drop-In that also included a safe injection site at the St. Stephen's Kensington Market location. And I am not finished. The reason I list my accomplishments is to show how having access to the past gave me the power to take advantage of opportunities to better myself and to put myself in a position where I could help others. Today I'm asking the Executive Committee to pass this motion now to reduce the cost of pass so that other people might not have to choose between eating properly or going to the doctor's appointment, job interview, or helping others. I've seen the current council do wonderful things, working together to achieve goals that are truly making Toronto a wonderful and humane city for all. And if you're wondering how to pay for this, just remember, when you provide the means to help someone stand on their own 2 feet and move ahead, they in turn can be in the position to strong enough to help others. I am proof that this is possible. P.S. I'm also now engaged to the most wonderful woman I ever met. Thank you again for this opportunity and service, Daniel R. Bingham. And the way that I was able to make this is last week I took training from Progress Toronto on how to make a deputation to the city. So moving on up. Thank you.
That's a great example of the work they do too, which I've seen firsthand, and it's fantastic. And congratulations on your engagement. Are there questions of the deputy? Councillor Ainsley.
Thanks for coming in this morning. Well done on your presentation and your training. When you talked about Metro Pass, and what do you think is an appropriate level for a Metro Pass?
I got to tell you, I'm shooting for a free because, you know, as long as when I had the MetroPass in my pocket, I didn't have to think about whether I could make a job interview or I could go to things. Opportunities don't always come up as scheduled, right? And sometimes you need to take advantage of them, and you can't allow not having the fare to get to these opportunities to hold you back from being able to do those things. It helped save my life, and I'm quite sure it will help enhance and save other people's lives as well.
Okay. And are you using a Presto card now, or?
Yes, I am. I'm sorry, I'm antiquated. I've been using the MetroPass, and it's a little bit more difficult to use. It seems that the operating of that system is still got some bugs to work out.
Right. And one of the concerns I get from a lot of residents in my ward that live in neighborhood improvement areas in particular is they still have to pay for a MetroPass. Like, you've got to pay the $6 and then load it. The TTC's talking about doing away with tokens and cash fare. Do you see that as inhibiting you progress?
I could see that it's going to be problematic, because I've heard stories about people using their MetroPass and they only load on a couple of fares and on that. And if there's some kind of computer glitch or it's not being read properly, sometimes they're being charged for a fare that they weren't able to use. And then when they try to go for recourse on it, they're stymied. And, you know, a lot of people don't have the wherewithal to fight for themselves and to actually express that they're having difficulties with it. So we have to try to make it as simple as possible. We need to have a reduction in the monthly pass, and that will give the opportunities for people.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Tory.
Thanks, Councillor Ainsley. Any other questions of the deputy? Okay, Mr. Bingham, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Susan Bender, Toronto Drop-In Network.
Is it quorum form?
Good morning and welcome. And you have 5 minutes.
Thanks. Good morning, Mayor and City Councillors. There's really so much to celebrate in the Poverty Reduction Strategy Action Plan, and I really commend the Poverty Reduction Strategy Office staff and all the City Department who have worked so hard and committed to the principles of reducing poverty. I'm going to speak to the transit initiatives. Back in January 2010, when the Fair Fare Coalition formed, it was in response to a really big jump in the price of cash fares. And at that time, the idea of transit equity, or public transit being a public good, an essential public service, and especially that there could be discounted fares for people who most rely on the TTC but actually can't afford it. That was not very common, and we had to fight very hard to get that on the agenda, and we needed to convince others. And now I think we're at a place where people do understand and recognize how important public transit is for social inclusion and equity and cohesion in our neighborhoods and across the City of Toronto. And transit equity is a key pillar of the poverty reduction strategy. So what residents of Toronto got was the Fair Pass program, and the Fair Fare Coalition did a lot of work to promote it, to make sure that people knew about it. We supported drop-in participants to help other people apply for it. We ran little clinics, and we also encouraged people to push for a more effective program. The Transit Fare Equity Evaluation Report really demonstrates that a transit fare structure that prioritizes affordability and has a huge potential for changing lives, for healthier people, stronger communities, and a more equitable city. And those are the same benefits that the Fair Fare Coalition and other concerned groups emphasized when we fought against fare increases over all these years and advocated for measures that made public transit affordable and accessible. So the report also points to how much more effective the Fair Pass program could be, if only. So if only what? So last fall, the Fair Fare Coalition did our own mini research, and we did surveys with 150 people in 7 different drop-ins across the city. And I just wanted to share with you a little bit about what we heard and learned from people. But for sure, the resounding message is that lower fares offered by the program, and especially the unique feature of the single fares, do make a really big difference, and that the benefits could be even greater and more impactful if the discounts that were offered actually related to the incomes, the real incomes and the ability to pay of people the program is for. And if the Fair Pass program, it needs to be fully rolled out in this coming budget year. So first, people told us that the cost of fares is still an issue. 57% of the participants of our survey indicated that the discount was not cheap enough for them. So people said, I like it because it's affordable and one can load coins. Another person said, it's all about cost. It's very expensive to use the fare pass. I really hope they keep the discount fare program. It would be really nice if they reduce the monthly fare to $50 because $115 is still too much. And finally, I feel more involved in getting out. Being diabetic is a good way to travel at a lower cost. The problem here is I need it to be covered by ODSP and not to use my special diet money. I need to go to food banks, I need to go to shopping for groceries, I need to go to do errands, I need to go to the doctor's office. It's not a surprise that the Transit Fare Equity Evaluation found that many people receiving OW are not using their fare pass, and fewer of them are using the fare pass compared to people receiving ODSP. That's because you have a maximum of $343 a month as discretionary or flexible funding to cover all your basic needs, and clearly it doesn't. Secondly, people who could really use the fare pass are still not getting it. People who aren't receiving Ontario Works or ODSP or child care subsidy. Someone said to us, since I am not an OW or an ODSP, I am not able to get the fare pass, though I am still considered low income. It would be great if they offered the pass to all low-income families rather than just those on OW or ODSP. I work, but the price of transportation is still very high. So I really urge this committee and City Council to fully commit the City of Toronto to achieving transit equity. And that would mean rolling the Fare Pass program out according to the original timeline and fully funding the Fare Pass program in this budget. Next budget or the next budget or the next budget, there's no guarantee there's going to be more funding. So just do it now. And more importantly, as other speakers have spoken to, free transit for people who are receiving social assistance, given that there is no money in the basic needs allowance for folks, and they have to make all sorts of different kinds of decisions to be able to get to where they need to go.
I'll have to ask you to wrap up there.
Okay.
Thanks.
And then the other two recommendations is to provide a $50 monthly pass and $1 single fare for people on low incomes. That is something that we tested across the communities, and it resonated with people. People said, I think I could do that with 3% of my income.
I will have to ask you to stop. We're
Okay.
fifth.
And I'll just say that there's a fuller report that I've provided to the...
Yes, we appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there questions of the deputant? I just wanted to ask you one question. You were talking about some of the work that you've done in talking to people, and we appreciate that, going out and sort of promoting this. Going from memory in the report, it indicates that, say, of the existing categories of people that, as you, to use your expression, as we rolled this out, we started, as you were suggesting, with OW and ODSP recipients. Mm-hmm. And the report indicates about 60% of those who are eligible have as yet signed up, in effect, for a discounted fare pass. Mm-hmm. I wondered if you had any advice for us with respect to how we could, perhaps with help of people like yourselves, how we could get that up to 100, because the intention was to take it out roll it out in groups of people. We added next the child care subsidy, which is a bit easier because, you know, those are people that we have a list of, as we do with OW and ODSP. But can you comment on why 40% of people wouldn't have taken advantage of this?
Well, we heard a lot of barriers to applying. Some people didn't know about it, and it was kind of dependent on their relationship with their OW or ODSP worker, which for some people, they don't have a lot of contact or it's not positive contact. People are afraid of the Presto technology because of the glitches, and we know people who are coming to drop-ins, for example, are far more likely to be challenged by a transit enforcement officer if their card doesn't work. So there's a lot of kind of education and trust building that needs to be done so that people feel comfortable with the Presto card system. And then the bottom line is, well, $115, I still can't afford it. So why would I bother applying?
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Any other questions of this deputant? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just going on our threes here, Nation Chong, United Way of Greater Toronto, Michael Rosenberg, and Rachel Goel from Sistering. Those are the next three. Thank you for being here. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Mr. Mayor, members of the Executive Council. Again, my name is Nation Chung, Vice President of Community Opportunities Mobilization at United Way Greater Toronto, and we are pleased to have the opportunity to express our support for the Toronto Poverty Reduction Strategy Action Plan 2019 to 2022. Off the top, I'd like a recognition of Council Anthony Peruza, his leadership, and the excellent work of the staff, and thank you for the work that's been brought forward. This strategy's cross-divisional approach to city building is necessary and important. Comprehensive corporate ownership of the plan is critical to addressing the interconnected, systemic issues related to poverty, including, but not limited to, the urgent need for affordable housing, livable incomes, and essential community service which enable individuals and families to meet their needs and access opportunities for the future. As the need for support continues to grow in our great city, we are encouraged by this renewed action plan. As noted by the city, 1 in 4 children and 1 in 5 adults continue to live in poverty. Increasingly, residents of Toronto are finding it challenging to secure and maintain affordable housing, obtain jobs, and provide livable incomes and connect with needed services. Some groups are disproportionately impacted by poverty. Our research on the growing income gap found that average incomes of young adults, immigrants, and racialized groups in 2015 were either the same or lower than their average incomes in 1980, and that pay gaps continue between men and women. This is not news to anyone. We will continue to work alongside our city colleagues to address these gaps and applaud the city's targeted interventions, such as gender-based analysis and the anti-Black racism strategy, which addresses the disproportionate barriers experienced by specific populations in Toronto. We will continue to collaborate with the city on areas of mutual interest that offer significant potential benefit for Torontonians who are most vulnerable to the impacts of poverty, and we are pleased to see these areas receive continued support in the poverty reduction strategy. For example, the implementation of community benefits framework, as well as the ongoing support for construction connections, which enable more people facing multiple barriers to connect to the labor market. Developing sustainable models of inclusive economic growth. United Way is working with Deputy City Manager Juliana Carboni, Mike Williams, General Manager of Economic Development and Culture, and Denise Campbell, Executive Director, SDFA, to pilot new initiatives while revitalizing neighborhoods in a way that includes and does not displace existing communities. This initiative, called Inclusive Local Economic Opportunities, is working with private sector leaders on coordinated, strategic, and multi-sector planning and investment. This kind of innovative thinking and cross-sector partnerships exemplify how leaders in the private, public, and community service sector can come together to build inclusive communities. Creating employment opportunities for low-income groups, precarious or insecure employment has become imprinted on our labor market, with almost 40% of working-age adults in the GTHA working in some degree of precarious employment. At the same time, young people are facing multiple barriers to connecting with the labor market and need wraparound supports, career pathways, and networking opportunities. Ongoing support is needed for successful initiatives like the Muslim Youth Fellowship and City's Pay program to get more diverse young people employed through the city. Also, we would urge the city to continue its leadership in increasing community-based investment, hiring, and purchasing. Social procurement is embedded in the city's community benefits framework and will help small businesses with social purpose to become part of the city's success. United Way and the city have a history of supporting such businesses through the Toronto Enterprise Fund, and we encourage you to look at expanding that support through an enhanced social procurement policy. Finally, and equally important, given the two speakers who were before me, we are encouraged by the City of Toronto's commitment to continuous engagement of community leaders, individuals with lived experience, and Indigenous communities as partners and advisors in meeting the goals of the poverty reduction strategy. Thank you to the staff again. Thank you to the leadership and the executive community for considering this renewed action plan, and we look forward to seeing this move to City Council.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. Are there questions of the deputant? Okay, hearing none, thank you very much. Appreciate your participation. Mr. Michael Rosenberg, the next three, Mr. Michael Rosenberg, Rachel Goel, Sistering, and Madeline Gold from Sistering. Morning, Mr. Rosenberg.
Okay. Hello, I'm Michael Rosenberg. The actions and activities in the report are expressed at a fairly high level with not a lot of detail. The initial consultations seem to suggest much more concrete actions. I have been told by staff that they don't actually intend that as excluding those more concrete actions. They see them as falling under the categories that are listed, but I just want to remind you of some of the items that I think need to be represented in terms of the actual implementation, and that they should not be forgotten just because they weren't explicitly mentioned. One of them concerns the employment aspect. There's a section on city hiring practices that really doesn't contain a lot of detail. It's listed under a sort of an equity section or providing work to poor people. I see it more as belonging under Section 13, which is the general economic growth and prosperity section. In other words, specifically the issue of reducing unnecessary educational requirements in city job descriptions. That will not just help specific groups of people, it will help the entire economy by getting people spending more time working and less time training to work. So it's actually a general prosperity initiative. And I hope that that section on city hiring practice will be seen in that context as prosperity, not just sort of a help to poor people. And I hope that it will also definitely include some of those specific aspects, such as removing unnecessary educational requirements from job descriptions. I also want to comment on the consultation and evaluation processes. It's a good thing that many different types of groups were mentioned, advocacy groups, community groups, organizations of various different types. And so I hope that means we're not just limiting the consultation, as was the case in the first couple of phases. It seemed to be limited only to extremely large charities and to poor people themselves. The vast range of community groups and advocacy groups and even businesses were really left out of that process. I hope that that will change now. They are mentioned, so that's good. But what I don't see yet is they're mentioned mostly in the context of forums and consultations. I want to see a permanent advisory committee that involves the community groups, the advocacy groups, the businesses, and not just the large organizations. Couple other points just to emphasize the issue of poverty itself is described in the report mainly as only being about differences between people who have less and who have more. I think we also need to see it as an overall decline in the economy. There are many effects of technology which have reduced actual useful, productive economic goods and services output, and even climate change has costs that have reduced and reduced the size of the economy in terms of having created extra expenses. So there needs to be more of an understanding that there is an actual threat to prosperity as a whole in the economy, and it's not just a matter of some people not having as much as we would like. It's a matter of everybody not having as much as we would like, and that should be the context of how the overall issue of poverty and prosperity is understood. And my last final point is just on the one issue related to transit, which is the transferable fares, which is a totally separate issue from the reduced fares. The transferable fares are essentially built into the existing system because tokens and tickets are automatically transferable, but they are going to have to come up with a replacement for that, as you know. Transferable fares are not even about the price. The price is exactly the same as the ordinary fare. The problem is that there are technical difficulties. They need to solve a few problems, and I just want to make sure you understand that those problems have to be solved. They need to have a separate seniors ticket type, which they do not currently have. That could be as simple as a separate serial number range, but they need to be able to identify tickets as being either adult fares or discounted fares so that you can actually make them available to all community groups and not have to worry about the distribution of them. So you need to solve those problems and make sure that transferable fares, because transferable fares, although an organization pays the full fare on them, the person who receives them pays zero. So this is an even better way than the discount fares for those particular organizations and the particular people who are receiving them. And you need to make sure that this is understood, that the purpose of the replacement for the tickets and tokens is the transferability, and that includes the seniors as a distinct lower price fare. So you must solve that problem. It's a distinct and separate problem, and it has to be solved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenberg. Are there questions of this deputy? All right, thank you very much. We have that last point. Sorry, Councillor Perruzza had a question.
Transferability, what do you mean by that?
With the existing tickets and tokens, one person can pay for them and another person can use them. And that's done in many different organizations and groups that give them out. It's not just done for like strictly charitable purposes. It's done for events. It's done for advocacy groups. It's even businesses give them to their customers or employees to run errands. So right now, I mean, this is a fairly long and complicated matter, but right now, the certain aspects of the problem have been solved and certain aspects have not been solved. So the Presto has produced a physical object called the ticket, but the problem is the TTC cannot use it for the purposes I'm describing effectively. They're using it for a different purpose, which is completely unrelated. They're using it to replace cash fares at stations where they're no longer going to have collectors. That's irrelevant and unrelated. In order to be able to use those tickets as a transferable fare, a totally different solution is needed, which is easy to implement. It just has to be done. And that is, they need to be able to have a distinguishing feature in that ticket to say whether it was purchased at a senior's fare or at a adult fare. Because until they can do that, they cannot actually properly sell them and distribute them as a transferable fare.
No, I understand that. I just misunderstood it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any other questions of Mr. Rosenberg? Thanks very much, sir. Rachel Goal or Gale? Goal, I had it right the first time. Thank you. And from Sistering and Madeline Gold. Are you going to appear together?
Rachel's going to speak for both of us. I'm Madeline Gold.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Very good. Thank you. So you have 5 minutes, and because you were listed separately, I'll give you some latitude.
No, together, 5 minutes. We're good.
Give you some latitude on that, though. If it takes a minute longer to speak on behalf of people who could have taken 10, then so be it. So please, you're welcome, and thank you for coming.
How did you get here? No, I'm not talking philosophically because I've only got a few minutes. But how did you physically get here? A few of you may say you walked here. Some may even have the privilege and ability to drive here. But for most folks, the TTC is the main form of transportation. Many people often forget how inaccessible the TTC is for some people due to the increasingly rising costs. Not only is the TTC now inaccessible for a large group of people, including the homeless and low-income populations, it also isn't providing services or resources to help combat this reality of inaccessibility. Now let's dig deeper and figure out as to why this is so crucial to draw attention to for all of us. With TTC prices rising higher than inflation in the last decade, with poverty ever so prevalent in Toronto, it is key that we have infrastructure that is accessible and comprehensive of all needs for all populations. With the TTC expected to recommend a fare increase in 2020, the City Council must move quickly to implement the fare pass as soon as possible in all stages for all eligible people and introduce deeper discounts. You may have heard of the unignorable tower online lately presented by the United Way, which expresses the amount of poverty and homelessness that is still prevalent in our wonderful city of Toronto. According to the statistics provided by the United Way, Toronto is the poverty capital of Canada, with 1 in 7 residents currently struggling to make ends meet. Life is hard enough for 1 in 7, and any efforts to alleviate the stress and burden of inequality is imperative. The Fare Pass was improved in December 2016 and is currently being phased in. However, 27% of people reported that they still can't even afford to use the Fare Pass, and it could be years before the Fare Pass is fully implemented to allow all eligible low-income people to use it. We cannot allow 27% of our community slip through the cracks, especially in harsh Canadian winters. I'm here today with my peers and fellow advocates to fight for a strategy that allows infrastructure, accessibility, and our community at the forefront. The strategy that we propose includes some of the following action plans. First off, we must create a system of access passes and fares that are geared to income. A free TTC pass should be given to folks receiving ODSP and OW benefits. This pass needs to be free because any amount is too much to pay given the large inability for the basic needs allowance to take care of actual basic needs. With this in place, OW and ODSP recipients should still be allowed to be eligible to volunteer and have employment support benefits. In addition, $50 TTC Metro passes and an equivalent reduction in tokens, meaning $1 token, should also be offered to folks who live at or below the LICO or are not receiving OW or ODSP. Furthermore, accessibility can be increased by giving bulk discounts to organizations that purchase TTC tokens for people who use public transportation to access their programs, services, and referrals. Social service agencies that participated in a Fair Coalition survey indicated that they spend an average of $14,000 a year providing tokens to folks accessing their services. Demand for tokens is outstripping supply, and most agencies are not receiving increased funding to deliver on this. These strategies would allow the 1 in 7 struggling to make ends meet to maybe become a 1 in 15 or a 1 in 20. Nevertheless, it will make a difference. It will count in the lives of so many individuals. Help us make the unignorable tower poverty less prevalent in Toronto through these strategies mentioned previously. Thank you. Questions? Yeah, I'm done.
So are you completed with your remarks? Oh, thank you very much. That's, I'm just making note of a couple of questions. Are there questions of the deputies from others first? Can I just ask you a couple? And this is, I guess, really just more typical of the decisions that we have to make here with you know, sometimes scarce resources, especially in the face of cutbacks that I think you're familiar with that we have experienced. If you had a choice, and we do end up having to make difficult choices here between what I heard you advocating, which was, say, a $50 or free pass for OW and ODSP, versus what in fact we've been doing, which is to sort of spread those resources over a larger group of people over time, which includes starting with ODSP and OW, then moving to the child care subsidy recipients, and then now moving to the lower income groups as defined by their actual income. They may be working or whatever, not on social assistance. If you were, you know, taking that choice that we clearly have in front of us to do it the one way we've started down on versus the other way that's different. And I know it's easy to say do both, and I think we'd like to do both, but if you had to make that choice, would you opt more in favor of taking the groups you identified that are on, what's the word I'm looking for, fixed amounts of social assistance and giving them more help, as opposed to expanding the group to include people who are maybe lower income but maybe working, for example, and not on social assistance?
I'll answer. I believe it should be for anybody with a low income. Don't separate the two.
Yeah.
Because some people just make minimum wage and can't afford the transit, right?
And just like a clarification, I was stating like having a free pass for all folks on ODSP or OW, but the $50 TTC Metro passes for folks that are still LICO but are not on OW or ODSP.
Sorry, the people that are which?
On like below the low income cutoff.
Yeah. Okay, so the $50.
But aren't on OW or ODSP, that's who would.
Everybody.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was speaking to a question of kind of lowering the price at which a fare pass is made available to those people to $50.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
And then who would get the free one then? The OW and ODSP people, or?
Yeah, and on OW. Because their basic needs, like, supplement that part of OW or ODSP, that isn't enough to cover basic needs as it is, so if they have to also buy it.
So that very much relates to my second and final question, which is, have you engaged in some advocacy, and would you agree with me when I suggest that speaks to the question to some extent as much as it does to who's providing what discount on transit, to the adequacy of the social assistance? We, as you probably know, we rely on property taxes to get most of the money that we dispense for all the different things we do. Whereas the other governments that actually are the ones providing the social assistance, OW, ODSP, by and large, it's provincial. And have you been to talk to them about either increasing or helping us, with the transit pass that we might make available so that we could look at the prospect within available resources of making a transit pass available to larger numbers of people or at a greater discount?
I think that's like definitely one of my next steps, but for right now, I think I was just, starting my research and really starting to get involved in this. So I think that's definitely like in the future. First, I want to start micro, go macro.
Thank you. Those were my questions. Anybody else have any questions? All right. Thank you very much for coming today. Much appreciated. Then we have Shauna Tepper, York University, Susan Gapka, Toronto Trans Coalition, and Michelle Danino, Jane Finch Community and Family Center. Those are the next three. So Shauna Tepper is next.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here this morning. And we saw many of you at the reception that we held in the Members' Lounge yesterday, so it's nice to see you all again. And it's quite fortuitous that this particular report was on the agenda today. So recently we've been paying particularly close attention to the city's poverty reduction efforts because we're now starting to see poverty on our Keele campus in much more acute ways since the subway extension opened. Over the past 2 years, we've been seeing a dramatic increase in the number of homeless individuals that are coming to our campus. And where we used to have a core of only a handful of folks that would come up on a regular basis, that number's grown to about 60 over the last 2 years. And so to the credit of our community safety unit, our staff are trying to respond to the needs of these individuals and give them support and referral services as much as possible. And they've even engaged our Faculty of Health to have nursing students do their placements with them so they can try to offer some immediate health services. And about 6 months ago, we convened a larger group to try to respond to this issue, including Councillor Peruzza's office, which has been incredibly engaged and responsive to our requests to come and help. And we've also been reaching out to local community organizations, although none of them have a particular mandate to work with people living in homelessness. And finally, we've also been asking Streets to Home staff to come up. And while they continue to come up to our campus as often as possible, we know they're stretched thin in terms of their own resources. So everyone's doing the best that they can in an area of the city that really doesn't have the infrastructure or the resources to respond to homelessness. And we know we're far from unique in this particular context, and that the city alone can't respond to an issue as massive and complex as homelessness specifically, or poverty more generally. But what the city can do, and what we're really pleased to see highlighted in this report, is an emphasis on your role as a steward, facilitating, convening, and establishing partnerships that drive systemic change. As a university invested in social justice and the public good, we know that we have a role to play in reducing poverty in the City of Toronto as well. We define ourselves as an anchor institution, and as a university, we've adopted an anchor framework that guides our work in this area. In particular, we're very committed to workforce diversification through both local hiring and diverse hiring initiatives. And we're working with our own HR department to look at our local hiring stats and develop ways to boost those numbers, especially for people living within the Jane Finch neighborhood. We've also been focusing very heavily on the development of a social procurement policy for the university, and we have several pilot projects that are underway at the moment. And we have a great working relationship with Wayne Chu, who I see over here, and Anchor TO, and they've been instrumental in helping us advance our social procurement work in particular. But there's more that we know we can do in partnership with the city. York University has the expertise to help in areas including the evaluation of your existing services, experiential education placements to support various areas of work highlighted throughout the report, data and best practices in the area of homelessness, and some of you may have spoken with Professor Stephen Gates yesterday, who is here from the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness that's housed at York University. And we also have the ability to provide support in the area of gender-based analysis that the report speaks to. So I will close by echoing the comments made by our president, Dr. Rhonda Linton, yesterday, when she said that our doors are always open to the City of Toronto. We're here and we want to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you for taking part today in this discussion of our poverty reduction plan. We appreciate that. Are there questions of the deputy? All right. I will thank you very much for being here. Susan Gapka, Toronto Trans Coalition.
How do I get that? There. Morning.
Hey, Susan. You know the drill here.
I'm just trying, there. Oh, I've done that. It's a little dated, but I'm going to use, hi. Good morning. I'm Susan Gapka. I'm chair and sort of co-founder of the Toronto Trans Coalition project. we're here to support, I'm speaking on behalf of our organization, I'm here to support the poverty reduction strategy as is, not as is, with an amendment that under population access, that trans and non-binary people be added to the poverty reduction strategy, and wherever it says gender, it says you would add gender identity and gender expression. I originally brought recommendations to the strategy when it was being developed, especially around transit fare, and was sad to see that we didn't become a specialized group, because I think our community really struggles around poverty. And access to things like housing and income security. But I have been busy. I applied for the League Poverty Reduction Group Advisory Committee and was shortlisted but not accepted. I'm sure I would have repeated that message over and over again over the following years. But a couple things happened to me since then. I actually got a job. I'm coming up, in the spring will be 5 years employed in casual labor at the 519 Community Centre, or formerly Community Centre, and I've gotten active with my union, CUPE, and I'm at an executive level and making recommendations around employment, around trans inclusion there. But also, our Toronto Trans Coalition project, we did a report on needs assessment, and some highlights. So I'm just going to look at the time and be very cautious of your time and our time, but I just wanted to highlight a few things that we found, because while we have a legislative framework, which is helpful, and noticed around us, not everybody was doing well. And so we wanted to find out more about how people in our communities were accessing social determinants of health. This is an overview from our AGM, and we surveyed, how do I do this? The mic isn't long enough for me. But we surveyed, we had 281 online surveys, 236 from the GTA. We had some focus groups, and the report is now available on our Trans Coalition. I wrote it down somewhere on the last page. Here's some things we found out about financial security, and I'm just trying to hold this up here. Many of our respondents were struggling with financial stability, and that's fits in neatly into the work you did in this report around good jobs. 56%, I'm trying to hold that still, 56% live paycheck to paycheck. 17% were unemployed, and 40% either had precarious work or in multiple jobs. We had a few people who earned more than $80,000 a year, but they felt discrimination was still an issue. So I'm just going to go to the next slide here that I wanted to share with you. And in housing, similar outcomes, and you've identified housing stability as an important piece. And 23% in unstable housing, 12% in unsafe, and 13% in unhealthy. And 25%, and I'm one of those, had experienced homelessness. Many felt that discrimination was an issue. And the reason I'm highlighting those two areas just in the short time I have today is because we've identified projects we want to work on was around good jobs, around and housing. But other groups are doing some work in housing. So our group is divided into some corporate employment. And of course, I'm leading the part on trade and labor involvement. So just wanted to highlight some of our findings with you. I've noticed the time, Honourable Mayor, and just wanted to make that pitch and willing to meet with people just to see if there's an amendment coming forward to ensure that trans and non-binary people are part of the poverty reduction strategy so that we don't leave. I know there's a lot of us asking for specificities, but I'm willing to share these report results with members of the poverty reduction strategy, and hopefully that we can all get a hand up. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll make an inquiry of the staff as to whether I think that may have just been one of those inadvertent omissions in the course of listing people, but I thank you for your deputation. Other questions of the deputy? All right, Susan, thank you.
Thank you.
Michelle Danino, Jane Finch Community and Family Centre, followed by Hamish Wilson and Veronica Snooks.
Hi, good morning. My name is Michelle Dagnino, and I am the Executive Director of the Jane Finch Community and Family Centre. We are a social services agency in Northwest Toronto. We serve over 16,000 residents a year. That's a number that's growing by about 10% annually. We've had our offices in 4400 Jane, which is a Toronto community housing building, for 40 years. We also have offices in 2999 Jane, which is another Toronto community housing building, as well as our early on space at Yorkgate Mall and our youth drop-in space at the Jane Finch Mall. We recently embarked on a large capital renovation to our earlier space and expanded our footprint, in part in response to the constantly growing need for our services, but also in response to the difficulty we are having in providing services directly in TCH buildings, which was our operating model for over 30 years. In the last 2 years, 2 TCH buildings that we have worked in for over 35 years asked us and the partner organizations that we worked with to leave the buildings. Spaces that we were having our staff clean, spaces that we had renovated, and spaces that we provide 30 to 40 hours of weekly programming in. When I look at the poverty reduction strategy, I see a call for the types of services that the Jane Finch Centre provides. Early years developmental supports and parental workshops, income tax and benefit clinics, budget planning, youth leadership training and employment supports, anti-violence interventions, resident engagement, support for residents in city planning initiatives, local design, social, recreational, mental health services, and daily social groups for our most isolated and vulnerable of seniors. Yet this work, across most social agencies in the city, is done with very little city financial support. From a financial resources perspective, the Jane Finch Centre receives approximately $125,000 a year out of a $4 million budget. We last received an increase approximately 15 years ago. The city's reporting mechanism is as onerous as funders that provide us with 3 times the amount of funding. When the early years funding moved to children's services at the city, the reporting structures increased 5-fold from the reporting structures that had existed for 12 years prior with the province. The work of the city, and my caution with the poverty reduction strategy that has no financial resources attached to it, is to not have it increase reporting and other bureaucratic requirements onto already overstretched city staff and agencies without any teeth to see on-the-ground impact. We do not need further reports commissioned. We do need the city to partner effectively with those of us who are on the ground doing the work daily. The city is divided amongst those who have and have not. That divide is getting bigger, and everyone here knows that. Jane and Finch has been your city's most impoverished neighborhood for over 40 years. It is also the neighborhood in the city with amongst the highest population of sole support parents, renter households, and racialized people. Gun and gang violence is not a policing issue. Without addressing anti-Black racism and class discrimination, these bullets will continue to fly. Jane and Finch cannot belong to those of us who choose to work and live there alone. It belongs to all of us who see ourselves as citizens of Toronto. The gun violence we have seen in this city in this latter half of the year is directly connected to the lack of economic opportunity for young people living in Jane and Finch. The success of the poverty reduction strategy, as it currently stands, will rely heavily on the work of social service agencies like the Jane Finch Centre to provide the supports that keep families with food to make it through the month and care for their children to make it safely through the evening. The city must look at the mechanisms that are in place to make the strategy successful and think of your frontline agencies as leading that work. Thank you.
For those comments and for all of your work that you do on an ongoing basis. Are there questions of the Deputy? Councillor Perruzza.
So, thank you so much, Michelle. Do you have any suggestions on how we can, how would we would be able to expand those partnerships with local agencies?
So I think partnerships, I think agencies at the frontline level are very good at partnering. We've had to partner from a resource perspective and in terms of making our collaborations more successful. I think the city should see itself as part of those partnerships and incorporate itself into already existing collaboratives rather than developing new or duplicate efforts. I think the city often comes in and tries to start something that already exists in the community. And I think there is a disconnect between how the city sees its role in social services and how agencies see our role in social services. And without the city having a better connection and relationships with frontline agencies, there's going to continue to be duplication of, I would say, efforts more than money, because it's from a resource perspective, I think we actually do collaborate very effectively. But I think that there are bureaucratic requirements put onto agencies that make it harder for us to do our work, and I don't think actually are very helpful to the city in terms of providing access to information that they don't already have.
So what you're suggesting is that perhaps we should be looking at sort of in a more focused way, in a narrower way. So how would local agencies work on the fair pass system? How would you help out in that? How would we be able to better partner with you to, for example, deliver that program, just to try to understand it?
So, I think what was interesting about what you've heard today is you hear all of these agencies, resident groups, already working together on the issue and have been working together on it for a number of years. I think the city's role is really to go back to agencies and ask what then the implementation of this work looks like. Because what is often happening is the city is implementing a model. There is feedback from a community engagement perspective that model doesn't work, and then the city goes back and changes it after the fact. So I think what is challenged in the process is that a lot of times the processes are happening from a city perspective prior to engagement. And it's not that engagement needs to look like a budget that has you reaching out to thousands of people. The agencies, what we can offer is that expertise around what our residents need. So, it can look like engagement with a dozen agencies across the city who are going to have very good, concentrated, and from the ground up ideas around how implementation of something like the Fair Pass looks like.
Okay. So I guess what I didn't hear from you, let me ask the question, because I'm trying to sort of wrap my head around that. So what I didn't hear from you was, when you look at the report and you look at the action items in the report, and some of them are, meander into that territory that you're already working on. I understand that, I get that. But you don't see that us doing this work as in any way diminishing the work that you do, or in any way do you see that as a threat, meaning less money for you down the road if we're going to be doing this work?
No, I'm very supportive of the strategy. I think the strategy is excellent. My concern is that it becomes another tool for us to report on, rather than a tool to actually help us do our work better. And that has been my experience with 20 years of working in social services, that a lot of what have been very good strategies on the outset become another layer of bureaucracy rather than a way of us supporting better work.
That's always a worry. Absolutely. Sure. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Perruzza. I think Councillor Pasternak, did I see your hand up for a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. From a policy and funding and strategy approach, do you think more money should be put into preventing families or individuals from sliding into poverty, or helping people who are already in poverty for a soft landing or to get them out of poverty? Or do you see that as the same policy and funding approach?
I think there is a difference in the approach. I think from a strategic perspective and from a policy perspective, we want to stop families from getting into poverty. When we see the major issues in the city, and I can tell you from the perspective of someone who works in Jane and Finch, that for us the issue of youth violence in the city is overwhelming our staff and overwhelming our residents. That is directly connected to lack of economic opportunities for their families. And once you go down that path, and once a young person has picked up a gun, their life is forever altered. There are a number of steps before that happens and before a young person gets to that point. So yes, we need to support, and a lot of our work is, I talk about sort of Band-Aid solutions, is trying to get people connected to our food bank, to be able to make sure that they have enough food for the week. That matters to people currently living in poverty. But if we want to talk about long-term solutions, if we want to talk about the type of city where we all feel safe and valued and that we have the same access to opportunity, then it has to happen well before people are at the brink of poverty.
So one thing that's absent from this, that's out of our jurisdiction, is the public education system, particularly in elementary. Do you think massive resources into early education and early childhood interventions is really the key to preventing, you've mentioned gun violence, gang violence, or sort of a generational flow into poverty? Is that really the key?
The goal around early childhood intervention really is to support families, right? Is to support parents, to make sure that they have the skills to support their kids to be healthy, successful young adults one day. And for the families that we serve, they have so many challenges on a day-to-day basis, whether it be around accessing transportation, whether it be about accessing stable housing, whether it be domestic violence in the home, that the support to their children is not something that they are always able to commit time to. So yes, I agree, there is an enormous gap around those types of family resources. And if we give children the stable environment, if we give them access to good adult supports, if we get interventions in place early on, We see a number of children coming to our space with trauma. We see a number of our children coming with issues of disabilities. When those interventions are in place early on, we can guarantee a much better path later in life. So yes, oftentimes at 15 or 16, when a family's already experienced violence in the home, when a family's already living in poverty, that intervention is really a hope for the best, rather than what we would see as guiding them on a path to a better future.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Pasternak. Other questions of the deputant? Well, thank you very much for your very thoughtful submissions and your answers to the questions. Hamish Wilson, Veronica Snooks, and Jeannie Sun, Yonge Street Mission. Those are the next three. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you for your time. There are a lot of worthy, laudable goals within this, so well done. But like assisting climate chaos, or averting climate chaos, pardon me, the Vision Zero, a lot of other goals, will it actually happen? Where's the money to actually do these things? And as Mayor Tory alluded to, yes, it comes down to choices sometimes, funds for some things, not for others. Good programs, good goals can founder on the funding, and I think we're probably going to have a few more shortfalls looming from the provincial level cuts. So where is the money coming from? I think there's a whole set of opportunities that could help, must be applied, must be thought of at this point in time. While cars are costly to own and operate, there's much of their cost that's avoided by the owners, and it's instead shared by the broader public and future generations. Going back to an older book, Sustainability and Cities by Newman and Kenworthy, road expenditure. This was one of the hardest data items of all to gather. The trail of road expenditures in most cities is a tortuous path, whereas expenditures on transit tend to appear in a few easily identified publications. The split of responsibilities for roads between agencies, different types of expenditure, and different types of government made it a particularly difficult variable to trace. From another old thing, get roads off with making the car pay its way. There was a suggestion that user pay for the cars could lead to a 40% decrease in residential property taxes levied by the City of Minneapolis. And you may have seen this one as well, I hope, over the years, because I've been sharing it since 1996 or so, hoping that we'll pick it up. This is from the Globe of January 10th, 1996, in an article on how, there are hidden costs in our built form. A quote from Ken Cameron from Vancouver: "We realize that the public subsidy enjoyed by the private automobile amounts to $2,700 per automobile per year, or about 7 times the amount we subsidize public transit." I think all of us can relate to $2,700 one way or the other. It's a lot of money, relatively speaking. So I think what we have to be doing is going, okay, I think if we're wanting to actually make these poverty reduction goals happen in a good time frame, adjust for the crises that are coming up to greet us, which includes this particular thing. TTC needs $33.5 billion over the next 15 years just to keep going. We've got a lot of crises that are coming up upon us. So I think we have to make sure that we have a vehicle registration tax again. This is a choice that we could make. We have the ability to actually put something on. And if you think about what $2,700 is, what about, say, not even the same user pay as a TTC fare? How about, say, 13%? That would be a $300 charge per vehicle. That would raise $300 million. I think to make it really politically acceptable, because we haven't had anything for a while, you have to target, say, a third of this goes to the TTC for their capital and operating, a third of it goes to your roads, and a third of it goes to the general revenue, including support for this. This would not be popular in some quarters, there's no doubt about it, but if we actually had the paying, or the pain of the paying, here in the City of Toronto, I think it would make it much more easy, politically acceptable for the 905 people to start paying tolls on the Gardiner and the DVP. We have to actually really start to think about this sort of hard choice for the sake of everybody. And in terms of where our mobility is, I think this is a good summation as well, a graphic. This is our transit, this is our biking, waiting for the transit, and the Carcoon are in relative space and comfort, even though it's a slower going thing. So I strongly urge you, if you're actually serious about reaching these laudable goals of the poverty reduction strategy, you've got to put in a vehicle registration tax to make sure that it's funded. Fund it now. There's an awful lot of money floating around that's borne unfairly by the public. And it's been known about for decades, I think, although it's not going to be popular to have it go on. This is the sort of hard choice. If you're really serious about reducing poverty, we've got to have the vehicle registration tax, and I would suggest $300 per vehicle. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Questions of the deputy? Okay, thank you very much. Miss Veronica Snooks. Good morning.
Hi, good
Yes,
morning.
now good afternoon.
Good afternoon now, is
Welcome.
it? I don't know the time. I left my phone at home today.
Okay, 10
Feel
after
weird
12.
and unusual.
We have 5 minutes set aside for you and maybe some questions. Thank you.
So, okay, so thank you for your time. And I am a member of the Lived Experience Advisory Group. And within the capacity of advocacy, I have contributed my experiences and expertise towards the effective development, implementation, and monitoring of poverty reduction initiatives. We have provided insight and feedback on the City of Toronto policies, programs, and services. We worked improving access to social services across the City of Toronto. We have educated and informed city staff about the realities of poverty in Toronto and the diversity of experiences of those struggling with it. We shared information about the poverty reduction strategy and the Lived Experience Advisory Group with city divisions, the private sector, community agencies, and residents. We acted as conduits between communities and the city on poverty reduction-related activities. We also participated in the monitoring of the poverty reduction strategy actions. And on that note, I wish to suggest that the members that are finishing up on the first round of the league become some sort of alumni group to help mentor new groups and help developing some of the issues. So some members could also be moved into actual positions within the city. Many of us have come with lots of trainings and educations, and we learned quite a bit over the last few years working with the league, working with the city. So I'm also a member of the Dream Team, and during the league, one of our main themes was about housing. So our project at the Dream Team right now is called Safe at Home, and this project was, thank you very much, supported by a grant by the City of Toronto. So the Dream Team began work on the Safe at Home project in April of 2016 using a community-based participatory research model. We began conceptualizing our project using some of the key terms and ideas put forward by Crime Prevention Ottawa to acknowledge their ongoing advisory support. Our findings are based on the results of 56 residential surveys, 24 residents interviews, 146 non-resident surveys, two staff interviews, and focus group discussions. We also conducted 2 roundtable discussions and open dialogue through the City of Toronto's specialized interdivisional enhanced response SPIDER program. Most importantly, however, Safe at Home prioritizes the voices of those who have lived through home unit takeovers themselves. Thus, the findings, themes, analysis, and recommendations made here aim to bridge in the classic divides between systemic actors like law enforcement officials and institutional housing providers on the one hand, and vulnerable individuals with lived experience in these settings on the other. So I'm just going to, this is our report. I have passed the report for you guys to have a look at that when you have time. So the report The report has a summary of fundings, and one of them is vulnerabilities. That non-residents reported 4 main features that render people vulnerable to HUTs. Addiction, 95%, physical and mental health conditions, 87%, being a low-income woman with children, 47%, and being an older adult, 31.9%. We did not require residents to rank their own personal vulnerabilities, but those who chose to disclose them on surveys or interviews ranked addiction and health conditions somewhat evenly. We have also key themes, which is around trust and rapport, education, funding, community spaces versus community in spaces. During our roundtable, we spoke with Toronto Police Service and Toronto Community Housing stakeholders. We learned that police are obligated to work within the law while intervening in a hut, and often this means criminalizing both the dealer and the exploited resident. Moreover, 94% of non-residents and almost 100% of residents reported feeling as though law enforcement officials lack the tools and skills required to manage huts effectively. Fortunately, law enforcement respondents indicated they were open to discussing changes in their policy and practices in the field while handling huts. So I would ask that you have a look at this report, and we are asking for further support with funding and other initiatives to continue our research on this important issue of home unit takeovers, and to continue speaking to the tenants involved and the frontline workers who are reporting that they are also having a hard time knowing what to do, how to help people. So we're trying to help both parts with that. So that's our ask, is that you continue working with us and give our report a look at. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much. If there's any questions?
Your time today, but also as a member of the Lived Experience group, we appreciate that.
Yes.
Now, we've heard about your suggestion about the alumni, so
Yes, good.
thank you for that.
That's
Are there questions of the deputy? All right, again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Today and for your service. Members, just in light of the quorum-related constraints and also some obligations people have, different people for different things, I'm going to propose we take our lunch break between 12:20 and 1:20. So that allows us to sort of finish early and start early, if you're agreeable to that. So it still leaves the same hour there, but if we could do that. So it means we have time to hear one more person, and then we'll have 4 left of deputants after lunch, and then obviously discussion of the questions of staff. So are you all, everybody in agreement with that? Thank you. Jeannie Sun, Yonge Street Mission.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Jeannie Sun. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Yonge Street Mission. For over 120 years, Yonge Street Mission has provided wraparound supports and services that make possible for individuals, families, and communities to move forward. As a developmental agency specializing in poverty-related challenges, we are keenly interested in dismantling the barriers which trap people in poverty. As the Poverty Reduction Strategy Office was launching its work to develop the 4-year action plan, YSM was invited to support the process in 2 ways. First, to support the internal dialogue with city divisions to provide visuals which demonstrate the complexity and connectedness of the poverty reduction strategy to the broader system. Secondarily, we invited community input and voice into the proposed 4-year action plan. I'd like to focus my time on that part of the work. I wanted to take this opportunity to specifically thank and acknowledge the contributions of each of the organizations of the working group that we assembled in reaching out and mobilizing their communities to provide input into the strategy and proposed action plan. Although their contributions are inferred, they are not mentioned specifically in the strategy, but their contribution was invaluable in this work and would not have been possible without their passion and leadership in their communities. This small working group assembled included both grassroots organizations, resident leaders, and an agency partner that led conversations about the proposed action plan in their neighborhoods. Therefore, I wanted to publicly acknowledge the following members. Maytree, a charitable organization committed to advancing systemic solutions to poverty and strengthening civic communities through a human rights approach, provided invaluable leadership and support throughout the entire process. In Scarborough, the Scarborough Civic Action Network, SCAN, worked alongside Aging Court Services. In North York, the Bathurst Finch Social Action Group and Unison worked together. In the Downtown East, Friends Helping Friends and Poverty, the Regent Park Social Action Group, the Dan Harris Community Complex Resident Association, and Yonge Street Mission banded together. In the Rexdale area, the Citizen Empowerment Project and the Youth Council led that process. The Jane Finch Task Force's Economic Opportunities Group and the Jane Finch Community and Family Centre worked together in that area. Last but not least, the City of Toronto's Lived Experience Advisory Group rounded out this impressive group membership. This group demonstrated how much people in Toronto support a robust and effective poverty reduction strategy. Because of them, we were able to collect input from hundreds of residents across the city and generate some key findings for the city to build upon. Although I won't go into the recommendation included in our report to the Poverty Reduction Strategy Office, I wanted to highlight a few areas that we heard. First, increase the ongoing engagement and communication strategy to empower residents and local organizations to interact and participate in the poverty reduction strategy on an ongoing basis. Second, improve access to truly affordable housing, including an increase in the number of units available, as well as subsidies and support services. Increases the supply of funding to programs like subsidized housing will help to connect qualified individuals to much-needed programs and reduce wait lists. Next, strengthen transit, both access and affordability. Transit was called a lifeline, linking social and financial well-being. Improving access and affordability to transit for low-income households will greatly impact other domains, including employment, childcare, mental health, and much more. Transit is a high-impact lever affecting multiple domains in the poverty reduction strategy. Lastly, the community is encouraging the city to work together in partnership with other levels of government and public benefit sector for true system transformation. Breaking silos within the city and working together with other divisions was encouraged to ensure the most effective strategy. And I wanted to end by thanking the Poverty Reduction Strategy Office for all their work. Many of the recommendations are included in the plan presented, and we wish to encourage the Executive Committee to not only endorse the action plan, but also fully fund and resource to address the issues of poverty in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sun. Are there questions for the deputy?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So it being 12:18 and pursuant to the agreement we reached earlier on, we will recess for lunch from now until 1:20 sharp, when we'll reconvene and finish the deputations and have our discussion on this matter. Thank you very much.
No. They're certainly like backpedaling fast, right? Yeah.
Well, but I can say this, you're a counselor, so like staff could lipstick on a pig, right? Lipstick on a pig. You gotta laugh. It's still a pig. That's good. That's a good thing. Bring my key. I should have got a key.